This was George Mayer. Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is François Cornilla, and on behalf of my colleagues Rudy Bell, Laurie Assenzweig, and myself, I would like to welcome you to this teach-in, whose purpose is to seek answers to the 3 questions you can see on the flyer that is on the table over there, and that contains the latest version of the program. Thank you very much for coming at this extremely busy and tumultuous time of the year. We would like to thank all the participants, the panelists, the presenters, the moderators, the musicians, George Mayer, whom we just heard, Regulus Carpenter, and Spook Handy, all the participants whose names are on this flyer, with special thanks to our keynote speaker, Jumana Musa, human rights attorney who traveled all the way from Washington, D.C. for this event. And special thanks to the students whose No to Rice movement achieved such a wonderful success. And put together a very impressive panel with extraordinary efficiency in the last 24 hours. We would also like to thank a few individuals whose names do not appear on the flyer. Bob Boykes, professor of chemistry, who spearheaded this movement on the faculty side at the New Brunswick Faculty Council and in plenty of other places. Peter Klein, professor of philosophy, and Mary Shaw, professor of French, whose help was absolutely decisive in the last 24 hours as well. And Sherry Wolf of the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, who was extremely helpful in helping put together the student panel. A couple of words about the format. We will have, after the keynote address, we will have panels. The presenters on the panels, at least for the first 2 panels, will talk about 15 minutes each, then between 10 and 15 minutes each, and they will have, in every case, 15 minutes of Q&A with the panelists. We do not have a pause for food. There is food over there. What I would like to ask you to do, if that's okay, is leave it alone for now and start start getting to it at your leisure after 6:30. In other words, after the keynote address. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Jumana Musa, who is a human rights attorney and an attorney specializing in international human rights and humanitarian law. Jumana Musa has worked in domains as diverse as racial profiling, national security, immigration enforcement, criminal justice, and gender-based violence. She holds a Juris Doctorate from the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. She was also a lecturer on human rights in the Middle East and North Africa at Georgetown, by the way, at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in 2006. She has occupied a number of important positions in this field. She was successively a policy attorney for the National Network to End Domestic Violence in Washington, advocacy director for domestic human rights and international justice at Amnesty International USA, policy director and then deputy director of the Rights Working Group, also in Washington, D.C. until last summer. And she's currently the border liaison attorney for CAMBIO, which is an acronym for Campaign for an Accountable, Moral, and Balanced Immigration Overhaul. But I think what matters is CAMBIO. Thank you very much. And please join me in welcoming Jumana Musa.
Thank you. I've always been, I told him earlier, I'm not always big on introductions because it's supposed to be this laundry list of things that make you sound important enough for everyone to sit and listen to you. I think the relevant piece is for 5 years of my life, I spent time reading about, thinking about, advocating about, discovering what happened and what the U.S. did in the context of the war on terror. And that's why I'm here. And that's why I'm really actually grateful to be here, because I think what you all did in these past few weeks and months is amazing. And so I appreciate that you all thanked for me when I walked up here, or clapped for me, but let me clap a little bit for you. I was frankly inspired. I think my concern is that, as we get further and further away from that time, people forget. They forget what happened, they forget what it was like, they forget the mindset at the time, and I think that's the danger. It's not that we have to hold on to anger forever, but it's important to remember these things because that's how you avoid, or you try to avoid doing them again, right? Because the danger is there. It's always there. It doesn't go away. And so that's why I love the idea of the teaching. Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I believe that. I understand, and part of the debates, and this is part of what motivated me too, someone said, well, we'll never, it's going to be like 60 years, 100 years before we really know what happened. Yeah, I laughed when I said that because that's why I brought this book. It's called The Torture Papers. The majority of this book is memos, reports, and other documents that go through the U.S. use and condoning of torture within the context of a war on terror, as it was called. And so what frightens me is how much more we could find out for 60 to 100 years from now, right? However many years when they declassify things, it's already so bad what we know that I can't imagine what comes next. And so I wanted to talk about a few things in the context of Condoleezza Rice and what was her responsibility, right? Because there's always a question of, well, one person can't be responsible for everything. They can't know everything that went on. That's probably true. But I think one thing that we can all easily agree on is that Condoleezza Rice is a remarkably intelligent and capable woman. I mean, this is not at all in dispute, right? She is, from a young age, everybody knew this. She was a prodigy in so many things, including like classical piano. She's a very intelligent woman. She's a very capable woman. And she held two of the most high-profile positions in the Bush administration, first as National Security Advisor and then as Secretary of State. And so to assume that she could not have known these things were happening or wasn't intimately involved would be to assume that she was either incompetent, stupid, or completely marginalized. And given the role that she played, and you could look up her media appearances and everything else, that there's just no way that that holds water. And so then the question becomes, how much did she know, and how much did she defend it, and how much did she really blow smoke out there to cover up what was happening? And so as I started thinking about this, I went back and looked at some of the things that she said, because I think the best way to look at somebody's role and somebody's responsibility is to look at their own words and their own actions. And so I was going to look at it in a couple of ways. First, I'm looking at the build-up to the war in Iraq. This was where the U.S. went down this dangerous road to the idea of a preemptive war, right? Nothing had happened. We had not been invaded by Iraq. We hadn't been attacked by Iraq. There wasn't just the kinds of things that generally make you say, and now someone has given us grounds for war. None of that had happened, but we came up with this idea that it could happen, that they want to do something to us, and so we have to start a preemptive war. And that's actually a fairly dangerous road to go down because, to establish this kind of new norm, and the idea that the United States is doing this, it's very different than somebody would consider a rogue state or an outlier, or someone that others would say, Iran did it, North Korea did it, the people that always get poo-pooed in the press as those outlier regimes. It wouldn't necessarily make us think about how does this change the state of international law and international affairs. When the U.S. does it, it gives those kind of regimes that are seen as the outliers and the human rights abusers cover, but it also establishes a new norm, and that's what's particularly dangerous. I think one of the interesting things she said about the war, and all the things we know about it now, and I think that were knowable even before I got into it, this is one of our quotes. You see, this war came to us, not the other way around. There's actually nothing in the history that makes it look like this war came to us. It was fairly clear that people were building a case for this war that they wanted to have versus one that they had to engage in. There's a conversation about the war in Afghanistan, and you can argue that, and people will say, whatever they want to say. There was at least a basis by which people could think about engaging in a war that fit within the norms of international law, international humanitarian law. So I'm not here to debate that. This was really an outlier in terms of the approach to Iraq. There was a lot of efforts to do things to Iraq, right? To tie it to 9/11, Dick Cheney was particularly big on that, to tie them to weapons of mass destruction, to tie them to everything to say we had to invade. One of the things that she said, and again, these are her words, oh, indeed, there is a tie between Iraq and what happened on 9/11. It's not that Saddam Hussein was somehow himself and his regime involved in 9/11, but if you think about what caused 9/11, it is the rise of ideology of hatred that these people drive airplanes into the buildings of New York. So he might not have actually had any real connection to it. But it's that kind of thinking that a place like Iraq fosters that would lead people to crash planes into buildings. So there's some kind of tie between the mentality of a leader like Saddam Hussein, who was for a long time, and I'm sure many of you are aware, a client regime of the United States and protected by the United States, but now was out of favor with the United States, and much like the Taliban. And so now he was, just out there fostering the mentality that got people to do things like crash things into buildings. This is part of the foundation that we're building a war on. And then there was the questions of weapons of mass destruction, right? Which George Bush famously joked about at a White House correspondence, said, "Oh, they're not over here, they're not over here," because this is apparently a funny thing that you built a false case to go to war. And she said a number of things, and one of them she said was this. People asked her, well, where's the smoking gun? She replied, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. Okay, and so now if you take all this in the context of the time, there was a very real attack on the United States. It was frightening. And, I don't know where all of you were or how old you were, but, if you lived in the United States and you knew New York City and the skyline, the World Trade Center was always the iconic image of the New York City skyline. If you lived in D.C., the idea that the Pentagon would be on fire with a large hole on it is wholly frightening. I mean, it was not an easy day to be. I lived in Washington at the time. I actually lived in Virginia and couldn't go home because I was told by a Capitol Hill police officer, you can't go through the city, you can't go to Virginia, just go to Maryland. And that was my instruction. So I don't want to in any way minimize what that was like. It was horrific, it was frightening, it was all of the things that everyone has described it as, even just the days and weeks afterwards of watching family members, particularly in New York, walking around with photos of their loved ones, trying to figure out had anyone seen them, did anyone know where they were they in a hospital, had they somehow made it? It's heartbreaking. And so now you have the biggest terrorist attack on U.S. soil that was done in a way that was really weighed on people's psyche and influenced the way people thought about things. And this was the context of that time. And, immediately what happened was there was an invasion of Iraq. The building of the case of war in Iraq very much played off of those fears, those images, and those feelings that people had, and rightfully had, right? It was a horrible thing, but then parlayed it into something that a few wanted, but wasn't necessarily there. And I think finally, there was the State of the Union speech, where Rutgers talked about, I think it was those 16 words, when they talked about looking for uranium in Africa. And when asked about that later, if you look at the history of it, there was a lot of controversy within the administration of people saying there's no basis to this. In fact, the ambassador who went there and said there's no basis to this, rather than get believed or listened to, his wife, who was a secret CIA operative, got outed, right? And so this was what happened if you didn't go along with the program. And when later on it was proven to be false, her response was, well, there was no objection from people in the intelligence community. If they had uttered one peep, it never would have made it into the speech, right? Apparently, there was talk about it, but no one told her, this is what we're meant to believe. And then this is all important in the context not just of being peace-loving people or not liking war, but in the context of what are the real costs of war. And so I think one of the things that's never documented well is how many people died in the Iraq War. And I've seen estimates that have gone anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 to up to 1 million. If you look at everything from direct bombings and shootings to the violence that then stems from that to people who just didn't have enough food or clean water. But if you go with the most conservative estimates, and which came from WikiLeaks documents, they documented 109,032 deaths, broken down into 66,081 civilian deaths, 15,196 post-nation deaths, 23,984 enemy deaths, and then 3,771 friendly deaths. So what that means is enemy deaths were at a third of what civilian deaths were. And that means that over 100,000 people, at a minimum, lost their lives. And then you multiply that with the family members, etc. That's a lot of lives lost, a lot of families broken for a war that was started on a faulty premise. A total, from the U.S. side, 4,486 U.S. soldiers were killed between 2003 and 2012 in Iraq. So, if you assume that most of them are from different families, that's almost 4,500 families in the U.S. who lost a family member for a war that was started for want and not need. The other thing that was really clear that happened in Iraq, particularly in Fallujah and also in Basra, was the use of chemical weapons, depleted uranium. And I know people go, oh, maybe it's controversial. We have to remember Fallujah was seen as a hotspot for militants. It was also the place where a number of U.S. contractors were attacked, hung from a bridge, burned. Again, a pretty horrific thing. But what happened next was more like retaliation than actual sort of addressing the problem, where Fallujah was really roped off and attacked for a number of days. And in that context, the use of depleted uranium was clear. And if you don't think it was clear, you can look at what's happened since. Also industrial, but I'm looking at statistics from Fallujah. Doctors there and also doctors here and the scientists who have studied this have found things like in 2010, the rate of heart defects in Fallujah were amongst babies were found to be 13 times the rate found in Europe. For birth defects involving the nervous system, the rate was 33 times what was found in Europe. And birth defects were everything from babies born with cleft palates, elongated head, one baby is born with one eye in the center of his head, overgrown limbs, short limbs, malformed ears, noses, spines. There's photos of all this, so it's not theoretical. It's not just somebody talking. Other abnormalities that made newborns what they call render the newborn incompatible with life were presented themselves. And so when they looked at that, and one of the U.S. scientists who studied it showed that there was a 12-fold increase in childhood cancer in Fallujah since the 2004 attack. They saw that the sex ratio became skewed of 86 boys born to every 100 girls. And what was interesting, and with a spread of genetic diseases indicative of genetic damage. And what that was similar to, but a far greater incidence than what happened in Hiroshima. And I think we all remember Hiroshima. That's where the U.S. got the first nuclear bomb. So one of the doctors in Iraq visited Japan and met with Japanese doctors who had studied birth defect rates. And what they found that they believed to be from radiation from the U.S. nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that doctor was told that the birth defect incidence rates there are between 1 and 2%. That was Japan in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At this point, their log of cases that they've been keeping, there's a rate of 14.7% of all babies born in Fallujah who are experiencing some kind of birth defect. That's more than 14 times the rate of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, this is all on a baseless war. And Condoleezza Rice was in the middle of it. She knew the intelligence, she met with the intelligence officials, she met with the White House staff, and she helped build a case for war, and then she sold it to the press, and she sold it to Congress, and she sold it all over the country. And so, the idea that we can't know what happened, I think it's hard to not know what happened if we just scratch the surface a little bit. I do want to spend most of my time, though, talking about torture. Right? This big book I laid out here is called The Torture Papers. And I know that you lost your torture panel. I think it's important to note something. When it comes to torture, there's a lot of questions, like if you're one of those international, legal, nerdy people, you can have a conversation about, was Afghanistan an international armed conflict? Did the Geneva Conventions apply? Who did they apply to? And was it international armed conflict? Maybe Afghanistan started as one, then it turned into a non-international, blah, 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 right? Because that's all about what is the legal regime that applies. Because you're allowed to do some things in war that you're not allowed to do in peacetime, and depending on who's targeted, who's allowed to be targeted. But that's actually not relevant for the conversation about torture, and I'll tell you why. Torture is something that in international law is prohibited at such a level, there is actually no circumstance where it's allowed. So just to be clear, no circumstance. It doesn't matter if it's an international armed conflict, a non-international armed conflict, there is no conflict. It doesn't matter if a country has signed a treaty, they haven't signed a treaty, they passed a law, they haven't passed a law. In the realm of international law, it's called jus cogens. It means it is something that there is just no exception to. There's very few things that are there. Things like slavery, no exception. Okay, genocide, no exception. So that's where torture sits. It doesn't matter if a war is justified. It doesn't matter what kind of conflict it is. It doesn't matter who the target is. It doesn't matter if they were innocent or actually a really bad person. Okay, so I just feel like we need to say that at the outset, because that's the kind of justifications we heard. Is, we have to go to the dark side. These people, they're not like us. And we have to take the gloves off. This is how you have to get down and dirty. And this is how we started to justify the use of torture. What's interesting is that was not the public posture that Condoleezza Rice put out there. So these are some of the things that she said on torture. She said the United States government does not authorize or condone torture detainees. Torture, if conspiracy to commit torture, are crimes under U.S. law wherever they may occur in the world. I absolutely agree with her. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk in a minute about the little legal twists and turns that they took to make that sound like it was the truth, and it frankly wasn't the truth. The U.S. was engaging in torture, unquestionably. But that's what she actually said in response to the allegations that the U.S. had operated a secret CIA prison in Eastern Europe. We'll talk about secret prisons in a minute. She also went on to the question of, and this gets into how they started to justify the use of torture. That in terms of enhanced interrogation and so forth, anything that was legal and was going to make this country safer, the president wanted to do. Nothing that would be legal, and nothing that was going to make this country less safe. Unless you were there in a position of responsibility after September 11th, you cannot possibly imagine the dilemmas that you face trying to protect Americans. You were determined to do anything you could that was legal to prevent them from happening, to prevent that from happening. We were told nothing that violates our obligations under the nothing that violates our obligations under the Convention Against Torture. And so, by definition, this is where it gets really good to me. By definition, if it was authorized by the president, it did not violate our obligations under the Convention Against Torture. Done. Fantastic. So the president authorized it. That means it's not torture. That's not actually how the definition of torture goes, but that's how it went in their world. On the other hand, when it came to things like the secret CIA program, they hosted a number of secret prisons around the world. And their torture program, when she was consulted about it, and she was consulted about it, make no mistake, what she said was, quote, "This is your baby, go do it." So that sounds like a blessing to me. So I want to talk a little bit about the definition of torture by the U.S. at the time. They went through, and in many of these documents in here, you can see I marked this book up quite a bit, to talk about what do. They took the definition of torture and said this. They said it's only torture if it rises to the level of pain that one would experience when you get to organ failure or death. That's not a lot, right? That's actually much narrower than the definition of constitutes torture. And then, and this is something that we didn't even realize until Alberto Gonzalez was being confirmed as Attorney General in his confirmation hearing, it became clear that he did not seem to think that cruel and human degrading treatment was also prohibited. Just to be clear, it is just as prohibited as torture. Right? Because there's this idea of like, oh, you know, different people have different ideas of what's cruel and human degrading treatment, and we can't be subject to this very subjective theory of what constitutes cruel and human degrading treatment. I think it's not hard, but if you've ever seen the photos from Abu Ghraib, I don't think that's very subjective. I don't think being forced to pose naked with other prisoners, having dogs lunging at your genital, I don't think any of those things really look all that subjective to me, but this is how they painted it, why they shouldn't be bound by it. So they did this really neat little trick, which is, this is what Alberto Gonzalez, when he was White House counsel, what he said was, when we signed the Convention Against Torture, we had a reservation. Because you could sign treaties with reservations saying, we signed this treaty, this is how we understand this treaty. And so for the Peace on Cruel and Human Degrading Treatment, he said, we understand that as we understand cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment, both which is tied to punishment, right, and not just interrogation, and since the Constitution only applies within the United States, the prohibition on cruel and human degrading treatment only applies in the United States. And that was the theory by which they went on. And both he and Condoleezza Rice, some question about it in their confirmation hearings for Secretary of State, essentially said, these people don't deserve those kinds of protections. Right? That's the idea, these really bad people don't deserve these protections. And so that's how they went about engaging in a regime of torture. That tortured people all over the world, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Guantanamo, yes, in Guantanamo, in secret prisons in Eastern Europe, in Afghanistan, they had secret prisons in other places. And they also sort of outsourced their torture to other countries. So that's how they redefine torture, sort of get around the law. Again, these are documents that she saw. These are documents and discussions that she was involved in. So there's no clean hands in this. I want to talk about a couple of the things, because what we hear a lot is the term, and I'm sure you guys have heard it, enhanced interrogation technique, right? You know what that is? It's torture, okay? It's torture. It's really just torture. And it's a way to say euphemistically to make it sound like it's not so bad. But, you know, some of the things sound maybe not so bad to people, like forced standing. What does that mean? And Donald Rumsfeld famously, when he was signing off on the document, he wrote in his own handwriting, why is standing only 4 hours a day? I myself stand at least 8 hours a day. He had standing desk, if anybody's ever seen, he didn't work at a seated desk, a standing desk. That, of course, does not consider the fact that he could come and go as he pleased and move around. Forced standing, and Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights First did a really fantastic report on this you can find online, can result in a lot of permanent and damaging effects on the body. Everything from pulmonary embolism, which could kill you, chronic joint and back pain, and a whole list of other things. This is not a small thing. And if you think about sort of sometimes if you're seated somewhere for too long or standing in a line for too long, you get tired. But you can at least move around. I don't want you to think forced standing, but they're just moving around. They're like, hey, what's going on? We're standing. No, you're forced to stand usually in a particular position in one place. You're not allowed to move. You might have a dog, right, who's lunging at you. There's no telling. So this is not, you know, just standing around. You had things like temperature manipulation. That doesn't sound so bad, maybe. It was bad. It was bad enough that, at least in the context of the deaths that were studied in U.S. custody, one person died of heat stroke, and one person that was known as the salt pit, the secret CIA prison in Afghanistan, froze to death. Okay, so temperature manipulation wasn't, oh, I'm a little chilly, I should get a sweater. Temperature manipulation was hypothermia, death. Too hot, no water, death. Okay, so that's what temperature manipulation was. Sleep deprivation. And again, whatever, I've had 2 kids. We never have sleep deprivation. You got to get up. It's not the same thing. I mean, other than the fact that if you think about the circumstance here, that they had something, they used it at Guantanamo and other places called the frequent flyer program. What that means is they would take someone to a cell, let them go till they fell asleep for a little while, wake them up, move them to another cell. If you fell asleep, leave them there for about a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, wake them up, move them to another cell. This actually has, again, permanent and damaging physical effects on the body, which could result in chronic pain and other things, but also psychological effects. So people start to have dissociative behavior, fantasy-like behaviors. It can lead to depression and other psychological problems. So I just don't want these things to, that sound so not so bad to actually be taken as just an enhanced interrogation technique. And to be clear, those things, if you are in a U.S. police custody, right? So I think people are more familiar with that. If you ever watch Law and Order, you get picked up, they read you your rights. And then there's certain stuff they can't do. They can't beat the crap out of you. They can't force confessions out of you. Because, again, if they do that, then that stuff is not admissible in the court of law. Part of the problem with the full mentality that went into this was, we're not trying to prosecute these people. We are just trying to get intelligence and we need it fast. There's a whole other argument about why that's not useful, but that's where the thinking came in, right? So it's not relevant what we can do in the context of, arresting someone and putting them into a criminal trial. This is about getting information that's going to save lives. And so that's where these things came in. And then you had, the sort of big ticket items like waterboarding, also often called simulated drowning. Have you guys heard it called that? Okay, so it is drowning. They just don't kill you. Okay, you don't get drowned to death, but you are drowning. You have every experience of someone who is drowning. I don't think that if someone pulls you out of the water, you could say, I wasn't drowning. You just didn't drown, right? You didn't complete the thing. And this was, again, one of the things they tried to paint as not torture. Oh, and I guess I should have gone back a minute, because I think the other thing that was fascinating to me is not only did you have to get to the level of pain or organ failure or death, but you also had to intend to cause the pain versus intend to get information. So even if what you did was considered torture, your defense, and a lot of this was written as like one big legal defense, and one person described it as like what a mob lawyer for his client, right? To say, I didn't really engage in torture. And actually my intent was to get information. And so therefore, even though I tortured the crap out of the person, I was just trying to get information, and therefore you have a legal defense. There's a lot of legal defense around this. But waterboarding in particular had already been found in the Fifth Circuit in the United States to be torture. Like there is actually a court ruling that says it is torture. Everybody knows it is torture. Christopher Hitchens, who tried to say it was no big deal, subjected himself to it, and you can find that video online, and then he said it was torture. And this was not in his particularly liberal phase, right? And so the U.S. went, they ran the gamut from things that some people tried to argue is squishy, like some of the photos we saw from Abu Ghraib, where I heard that's not torture, that's just embarrassing, right? To flat out, everybody knows it is torture. And that's what the U.S. was engaging in. And that's what their interrogation programs were all about, whether they were in Afghanistan, secret prisons, Guantanamo, or elsewhere. And I think the other thing, and I've heard this from torture survivors as well, that people don't always think about is the psychological torture. And it comes in a number of ways. So some of the things like, have you heard the term stress position? Do you guys know what that is at all? Stress position is essentially forcing someone to stay in a very uncomfortable position. Either they may be shackled, you might be shackled to the ground where you can't stand up or sit down. You're just off the low. Anyone goes to the gym, these like squats against the wall things. They force them to do that. But again, for an extended period of time, not of your own choice, and you have no ability to make it stop. But what's interesting about that, if you talk to experts in torture, is that it's not just the pain that might be caused by that incident, but when it's something like, the stress position, it's not someone doing it to you. Now you have the psychological impact of this is your body failing you, right? Because no one has laid a hand on you, but yet you're suffering in this way. And then you had tactics that were purely psychological. I know one of the detainees who was in Afghanistan ended up in Guantanamo. When he was still in Afghanistan, he said that he heard in the next room the screams of a woman and was led to believe that that was his wife. And that if he didn't talk, it was going to get worse for him. And, indicating that it could be rape, it could be more. This, of course, is not at all physical. And nobody laid one hand on his body. But most torture survivors will tell you psychological torture is much harder to get over than the physical torture. And just to give you a quote from one of the British residents who was in Guantanamo, Bashar al-Rawi, he said, quote, "I think the psychological effect of this experience, in my opinion, far outweighs the physical. I think the physical effects you can just overcome. Psychological effects you live with all your life." And it's seen PTSD. People who've been waterboarded or something like that effect sometimes have a fear of any kind of water, taking a shower. And I said depression and PTSD, other types of psychological problems, it doesn't go away. And so that's why I think in some ways it sounds more minor, but it's actually so much more insidious. Now the U.S., of course, didn't just engage in their own torture because, why do that when you can multiply your effects by outsourcing and doing, letting other people do the things you really don't want to do. And if you think about the stuff they did, I think it's even more concerning that you're talking about stuff that even they didn't want to do. And that's where you got into extraordinary renditions, disappearances. So you guys heard the term extraordinary renditions? Again, to hear, and I don't have a direct one on this one, but to hear, well, the direct quote from Secretary Rice on this was that it was a vital tool in combating terrorism. And the way it was described as, it's just surrendering a person from one country to the other. No big deal, right? It happens all the time. Transfer custody. What makes an extraordinary rendition is this. It's someone who is transferred from the custody of one country into another outside of any legal process. There is no legal process. There is no opportunity to say I actually fear return to X country because I fear I'll get tortured. Or the fact that everyone knows if you get returned to custody in that country, you'll get tortured. And so that's another piece of the pie in terms of the torture pie that the U.S. engaged in. I'm trying to keep my eye on the time. I think I have about 10 minutes. Okay. And so if we look at that, what does it mean? It means this. It means the U.S. was taking people from places that were not considered a battlefield, that were not in the heart of anything, places like Sweden, Italy, Eastern Africa, and transferring them to other countries that tortured. And so the question of where is the battlefield at the time in that mentality, it was everywhere. There was a battlefield, there was a war as long as there was anyone within global reach that thought to do harm to the United States. That's pretty broad. And so that was the idea. The thing was the global battlefield, you could do anything you wanted, anywhere you wanted. And just to look at a couple of cases of what did that mean for people. There's the case of Maher Arar. Have any of you heard of this case? I think that's one of the most well-known cases. He was a Canadian. He was coming home from North Africa. He was not coming to the United States. So I don't know if any of you have a sense of transferring to the United States, immigration law in the United States, but there's a question in immigration law as to whether or not you've been paroled in is the term. And so like if you want to claim asylum, you have to have been paroled in, you have to be physically in the country. And that says when you're in the airport and you're in transit, that's why you're sort of cordoned off, you never come through customs, because you're not in the country, technically, not for these purposes, right? You're just, transiting onto somewhere else. So, you don't get a stamp in your passport, you don't have to go through customs, you have to do anything. He was not in the country. He was in transit. He was trying to go back to Canada, where he lived, where he had lived for many, many years. He left Syria for Canada. I think he was 8. Right? So this was not somewhere that he had lived any time recently. He was pulled out of transit and questioned by customs agents, by FBI agents, and others, based on information given to them by the Canadian government. It had to do with, he had some roommate that may have been questionable many years ago, etc. He was told that he was not going to, well, he wasn't trying to enter the United States. He said, fine, return me to Canada, return me to my home. They said, no, we're returning you to Syria. Now, just to put an exclamation point on that, this was at a time when the president had declared the axis of evil, which included Syria. Yet this was the other legal fiction by which they said it was okay to return someone to Syria, which was on the axis of evil, which was a place that every year the U.S. State Department documented cases of torture. They got assurances. And so what does that mean? It means that our government, someone like, say, the Secretary of State or someone in the State Department, went to another government and said, hey, we want to transfer this person to you. Well, while we understand you torture, we just don't want you to torture this person. And that government says, okay, we won't torture this person. And then they hand them over to that country. And in these rendition cases, we often see that they have a list of questions that's given to them by the U.S. government, and then they go about and do what they do. And so in Syria, he stayed in cell. They called a coffin. It was very small, very dark. And, even of the terrible things he described, and he described some terrible things, it was nowhere near the worst. Because like many torture survivors, he couldn't talk about it. So again, there's this question, will we ever really know? Not if the U.S. government had anything to do with it. But the Canadian government actually did the right thing, and they had a commission of inquiry into this case, which went on and looked at everything. The U.S. government, unsurprisingly, failed to participate. But the Canadian government determined that it was, it was wrongful anyway, but that they were at fault, and actually awarded him $10 million. So it'll give you a sense of, was this really warranted? No. Okay? The U.S. government has not only wouldn't participate, would not allow him to come to the United States to testify before Congress. So he did have an opportunity to testify, but he had to do it by video link because the U.S. would not grant him entry. And this was all part of the efforts to not just deny what was happening, but to also keep closed any avenues that would actually expose more of what was happening. Now, that's actually a very sympathetic story of someone who was just trying to go home. The family man didn't seem to be doing anything, but I want to be very clear. It did actually happen. Your dad actually worked on it, if you want to know the truth, but I worked with him on it. But it's a good question, because it sounds kind of fantastic, right? It sounds like the stuff out of movies. But I think the thing that we need to remember is that torture is not bad because it might happen to innocent people. Torture is bad because torture is bad. And these are not meant to be things that are bestowed on people. So this idea that Condoleezza Rice has, but the idea that she had is they're not deserving, this was never something that was supposed to be granted to people. These are restrictions on what governments can do, period. And so I think that's the part that they were always trying to skirt. And so there was a case of Abu Omar, who was in Milan, Italy, and was literally, very movie-like, abducted off of the street in Milan, bundled up into a white van with people who were dressed fully in black, faces covered, everything like that, put on a plane to Egypt, where he reports pretty horrific torture. Now, by all accounts, he had been under investigation by the Italian authorities, right, and other places. So nobody's arguing this man was this really fine, upstanding citizen that just got caught up in this whole thing. He was under investigation. This rendition actually interrupted the Italian investigation, which may have actually led to some kind of justice for people or stopping something. They sent him to Egypt, where he was tortured, unsurprisingly. He actually got a letter out, and it was, again, describing pretty horrific things. Electrocutions, beatings, the laundry list of torture issues. And it also, and because this is also not the reason you don't torture, you don't not torture because you want to keep good relations, but it made it more difficult for countries who want to actually exchange information with the United States. And in fact, there was a prosecutor in Italy who took the case forward and indicted and ultimately, essentially convicted 22 CIA agents of their role in this abduction and rendering. And the last case I want to talk about is the case of Khalid al-Masri, because this is where I get back to our good friend Condi. So Khalid al-Masri was a German who was born in Lebanon, lived in Germany, married a woman who was also in Germany, went to Macedonia on a vacation. Bad move on his part because his name, Khalid al-Masri, was like another name, Khalid al-Masri, who was someone who was tied to the Hamburg cell and thought to be involved in some of the Al-Qaeda planning. So he was detained in Macedonia, kept there for reprieve in a hotel being questioned, largely at the behest of the U.S. He was then transferred to U.S. custody, and they rendered him to Afghanistan, but to the salt pit. That was the secret CIA prison I talked about, where the other man froze to death. And he was there with a couple of other people, including, you don't even need to get into that. It was fairly clear early on, and I think it was December of 2003 when he was seized, and then a few weeks later sent to Afghanistan. It was clear fairly early on. I have to grab my water, sorry. It was clear that he was the wrong Khalid al-Masri. They had the wrong guy. The problem with that is now what, right? Because now you've abducted him, you've sent him to your secret CIA prison in Afghanistan, he's seen other prisoners there, he knows what we do there, and the things that he was subjected to were some kind of bizarre starvation diet that they were trying out, as well as other tactics. He had been injected with drugs, and this was actually proven by they tested hair samples, strip searched, given enemas, but had other things, put up the data. I mean, this was not, this was not big glove stuff. He was not released until May of the following year. So again, he was taken into custody in December. They knew early on that he was not the right guy, but he still wasn't released until May of the next year, of 2004, at the end of May. Condoleezza Rice was actually involved. She essentially said to Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor, sorry, my bad, but wouldn't say that publicly, that this was the wrong person, and that part of the decision to keep him long past when they realized he was the wrong guy was because of what he would say, or what he would be able to put out there. And they did bring his case in the United States. He brought his case. It got shot down on what a lot of cases got shot down on, which was called the state secrets doctrine, which basically means that, which is really a fantastic thing, because they keep saying state secrets, so even when there's information in the press that documents the entire thing, like Maher Arar's case, there's an entire commission of inquiry and tons of evidence out there. The idea that if they acknowledge it happens, it would damage national security. We all know what happened, but they can't acknowledge it in court because that would damage national security. And the real motivation there is to sort of cover up what happened. And again, Condoleezza Rice was right there in the middle of it. And so, the question comes back to, what does this mean? The fact that we know this much information about what happened. We know who was involved. We know who was calling the shots. We know who was involved in the discussion. And realistically, we know that nothing is going to be done about it. Because when the Obama administration came in, one of the things they said, and this was the Obama line, we want to look forward, not back. So what that meant is, we're not actually going to prosecute anybody. So the only people who really got prosecuted are the soldiers who showed up in photos. Okay, and not that many of them. And so, the rank and file, who were following orders from the top, got prosecuted. including, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a picture from Abu Ghraib. There's a couple of soldiers that were like giving a thumbs up next to a dead body, who was euphemistically called the Iceman, because he was killed in CIA custody in Abu Ghraib. The people who killed him never prosecuted. The people who posed for the photo prosecuted. So I'll just let you think on that. And that's sort of where the state of affairs was. There's not going to be prosecution. And people had always asked me, like, so what can we do? Realistically, a country as powerful as the United States, no one's calling them before the ICC. No one's going to sort of take their people into custody and put them, in front of some kind of international tribunal for many reasons. And, the largest one is the U.S. wields a lot of power around the world. And countries want things from the U.S. and so forth. But what I always said could happen is you end up with Kissinger's problem. And if you know anything about Kissinger, he consults his attorneys before he gets on a plane and goes anywhere. Because the other issue with things like torture and disappearances is that war crimes is they are universal jurisdiction crimes. So again, sort of a technical legal thing, usually jurisdiction means that the country actually has a tie. So like if I killed a citizen of France, they have a tie and maybe France can prosecute me. If you committed the crime in France, they could prosecute you. You have to have some kind of jurisdiction or some way that the crime is connected. When it comes to these crimes, they are universal jurisdiction, which means anybody can prosecute you anywhere, because that's how serious they're used, right? And so that has happened. I don't know that it's happened in Condoleezza Rice. It certainly happened to Rumsfeld and Bush, where they were planning a trip, and then someone was like, you might want to go there, and then suddenly the trip was canceled because somebody is filing papers against them. And I think it's actually even happening in Vermont, which I think was kind of phenomenal. But the other thing that could happen is what happened here, what I think is so great. Right? So you get invited, by who, to give a commencement address and get an honorary degree, and you're dusting off your speeches and you're getting ready, and it turns out people haven't forgotten, and that people don't really want to honor a war criminal. And I think it's pretty, it's in that same fall into the looking glass logic that people sort of push back and said, well, these students are shutting down free speech. And you know what? I am a lawyer, and I studied the free speech doctrine, and these students were actually exercising free speech. And they did it for me. And I was down with them. And, if she embarrassed to stand up and defend her legacy, then let her pull out. And that's how it goes. And so I think the last thing I wanted to say was just a quote from Spencer Chi. And I think it's one of those things that sometimes these problems seem so big, but I think every action is really critical. And so one of the things she said is the peace of our world is indivisible. As long as negative forces are getting the better of positive forces anywhere, we are all at risk. So hooray for the positive forces winning on this front. Thank you. I think some people didn't have teeth, so it's like an automatic transformation.
Many thanks, Ramona, for the presentation. Yes. I think this one. Getting up now.
So all of this was to say thank you. Thank you very much. We do have a good 12 minutes for questions for Jumana Musa. So I can either pass the mic to whoever wants to ask a question.
Do we have estimates on how many people were tortured in this program, in these programs?
A whole lot of them. And I don't mean to be cute about it. I mean, we know how many people were in Guantanamo, which is just short of 800 people, but there were thousands of people who came through custody in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we don't have an exact number. What we do know is, we'll never know the extent of it. That's true, and the reason I say that is, after the photos became public, the Abu Ghraib photos, it's not that these were the only photos that were out there, but it's that there was one guy who said, this is kind of a problem, actually took it to his superiors. Just to be clear at the atmosphere at the time, what happened was he actually had to go into protective custody. The guy who, the whistleblower, the guy who brought the pictures forward, because his troops turned on him, and because it was not looked upon favorably what he did. And there was a meeting in Germany where many of the commanders were called in and told, of course, it is your responsibility if you know these things are happening to bring it forward and to turn over any photos. Having said that, you should know that if this is happening under your watch, you could be prosecuted. Go for it. And so what became clear was not that you needed to actually root all this out and take care of it, but what became clear to people is if you have photos, it's time to destroy them. And that's essentially what happened, and in many different bases in Iraq. And so, we will never have the numbers. We don't even know how many people were detained in the U.S. directly after 9/11. So when it comes to those numbers, all I can say is in the thousands, and I don't have a better answer than that.
Well, Larry, right? No. I just want to acknowledge Larry that it is thanks to Larry that we actually got in touch with Rumana. And Larry worked with Amnesty International with Rumana. He also started the petition, the alumni petition against the invitation of Condoleezza Rice to this institution.
When I first heard that Condoleezza Rice was withdrawing, it reminded me of something that happened when I was a student at Rutgers. In 1989, there was a plebiscite in Chile. Is Pinochet going to get another term as president or not? So I asked people, who do you think is going to win, Pinochet or Pinochet?
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that we lost. And I couldn't believe that we scored this victory. But decades after that, Pinochet was arrested in England. And then he was brought on charges in Chile. And he died with his tail between his legs saying, please don't prosecute me, I'm a sick old man. And hopefully that's where a lot of people who committed war crimes are going to end up being. To what extent do you think what's been going on with the Feinstein Committee in the Senate has had an effect on Rice's decision to pull out, and what was going to be revealed or is going to be revealed in the classified documents?
So for those of you who maybe are not aware, the Senate Intelligence Committee had, called in the various folks and did a top secret review on torture, right? Nothing was made public, but they did their own report on torture in the Bush administration. They brought all the intelligence officials, of course, they all have top secret security clearance, their staff has top secret security clearance, and none of that was made public. And just recently, in the past month, or sometime, I don't remember exactly when it started, it became clear that in the efforts to keep things from the senators, that the CIA not only was maybe not totally truthful, but was actually accessing staff computers who were working on this report. Right? And so what really got, and this is what killed me, right? What got Senator Feinstein and other senators was not the details of the torture, which were pretty bad, but the fact that they were now subject to surveillance by the CIA and by other intelligence officials who were trying to keep this information. And so based on that, and they got fairly angry with it, they voted to declassify the report. I don't know how much her decision was based on that, and there's been some other things swirling about her. What I do know is that we're not even sure how much of that will be declassified. If any of you have ever looked at a FOIA document, and I think you can even see some of them in here, there's an Onion article that said something like, CIA mistakes black marker for highlighter, right? Because, it might be, you might get a whole page that's like black, 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 thus, black, black, black is, and so it's a question of what's going to come out. I think it very well could have weighed in it. She got kind of a perfect storm of things that's happening between the 9/11 Commission questioning whether or not she had, first questioning whether or not she had seen the relevant memo that said, bin Laden seeking to fly planes into buildings. She said, we couldn't have seen this happening. Didn't you get the report? I don't know what you're talking about. So I think she's got a lot of controversies around her. But I do think, more than what potentially embarrassing might come out in the report, the fact that students were sitting in and probably going to be flyering and doing other things was not exactly what, I think she was coming to give a speech and be, an important person and not necessarily be targeted as a war criminal. So I think, in my opinion, that probably had the bigger impact because, if people had let it slide and she just came and gave a speech, then no one would be focused on what was in any kind of torture report.
So last night on Fox News, Karl Rove turned his attention to Rutgers. And he said that what we said was factually inaccurate. I have the transcript for you all. He said they, meaning us, accused her of torture and waterboarding, which it is not. It has been held that it is not. So he's claiming that waterboarding, somebody decided that waterboarding is not torture. And then he said if it were torture, the Obama administration would have an affirmative responsibility to go seek charges against anybody connected with it. In fact, if waterboarding is torture, then the president the current President of the United States and the current and past Secretary of Defense are guilty of torture because they did something about the military. So, who decided that waterboarding is not torture?
Well, because they decided nothing was torture. I mean, you know, that was the entire legal regime, and they did consider waterboarding and decided it wasn't in fact torture. But here's the sticky thing. I kind of agree with Carl Rove, right? And that actually the president does have an obligation to prosecute. You know, so for once I agree with Carl Rove, and that's faulty. But
that was a good part.
yeah, that was a good part, right? But I mean, I think the thing is, even this administration has acknowledged this torture, but they're looking forward. You know, so that was the answer there. I mean, that was the whole point. When they went through and they actually considered every single technique, so the idea that this was just, you know, individual agents or military gone rogue is not true. They considered every single technique. They did a legal analysis. They analyzed it from the perspective even of who could be prosecuted and is it prosecutable, and how you define it so it's not prosecutable. And that's how it got decided it wasn't torture, even though U.S. law, U.S. case law said it was torture. So, you know, it's the same sort of legal.
Hasn't that legal opinion and that whole legal approach been discredited by now, or do we believe it?
Yeah. I mean, it has been. I mean, not for Carl Rove.
Well, the question is, so other than Karl Rove, Donald Rumsfeld, and a few other senior people in the Bush administration, is there anybody in the world who believes that waterboarding is not torture?
I think, honestly, the people who make that case, and this is just the truth, right? They're not even getting into the semantics of is it torture or not torture. I think it's just very much the approach of, you know, what we've heard the whole time, which is these guys are not civilized, they don't follow the laws, you know, we can't approach them with kid gloves and all the civilization when they're trying to attack us and kill us. We frequently heard from the Bush administration, you know, the terrorists, we have to be right 100% of the time, the terrorists only have to be right once. And that's the mentality that drove it, right? These are undeserving, they're not people like us, they don't understand this kind of civility, all they understand is the language of violence, and that's how we have to handle them. And that's the mentality that has fed, you know, this idea that we should leave be alone. They're doing what they had to do to protect America.
So we have about 3 minutes left. I think one question.
Can we just take two and then I'll answer both of them?
Okay.
At once, really fast.
I'm from the No Rights Committee, and we actually discussed that. We actually discussed doing waterboarding on College Avenue in front of all the other students to inform them of this horrible. They're saying mock, but I'm not going to say mock. Okay, I just want to know: is this something advisable to do? Is this something that we should do?
I'm not going to advise you on tactics, and this is in no way legal advice. I'll answer your question with his as well.
I'm not sure if this is a question or comment, but I don't know how many of you saw Wilkerson, who was the deputy to Secretary of State, being interviewed, Colin Powell's deputy, being interviewed yesterday, I believe, in which he said, look, I'm a Republican, I'll always be a Republican. And then he went on to say, so it was nice he said that because he was saying it had nothing to do with being a Republican. He went on to say the only thing that he is angry with President Obama about is that he simply has not brought about the prosecution of George W. Bush and the other guy, the vice president, as simply war criminals. This hasn't happened, and I dare say it never will happen. I fear. Do you think is it possible that it might happen? But I sure would like to see it.
I guess first to start with the mock waterboarding. Again, it's not legal advice. I think anything you do with that should have a doctor in prison. I don't know how you guys are setting it up in your head. I will say that for someone like Christopher Hitchens, who was an absolute believer that this was not torture, I don't know what you all are talking about. The minute he put himself under it, he didn't last but a second. And he was done. He knew it was torture. And I think people getting the visual of what it looks like really has an impact because, again, these discussions get sanitized by enhanced interrogation techniques, which are dropping a little water and all this other nonsense. And when it comes to people like Lieutenant Colonel Wilkerson, I think the other important thing to remember about the Bush administration is it wasn't a one-note administration. There were people on the inside who fought back and who argued. They lost ultimately, but they were there. And then many of them ultimately resigned, as he did. And so it's not just, you know, us bleeding heart, human rights squishy people who are out there saying this is all bad and wrong and not doing this well. It was people like the JAG, frankly, of the different military branches who said this isn't a good idea, but they were overruled by the civilian leadership in the Pentagon. And people like Lieutenant Colonel Wilkerson and people who understood this at a deeper level, interrogators and others, who knew that this wasn't serving the United States interests, that it wasn't doing us any good. And so they were out there, they're still out there, and I think that's an important thing to remember. When people get prosecuted, I'd love to see it. I frankly don't expect it. And it really does come back to the power dynamic in this country. I think Tennessee is a great example, but again, I don't think it's going to go the same way for the United States. But I do think that the one thing to be done is what's been done here, which is to make sure that they stay uncomfortable and that they never forget what they inflicted on others. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you again so very much for these powerful words and for these informed words, for these words where knowledge matters, where the proposition is that there are things that we can actually know. And if we know them, they put an obligation on us, on all of us. Without further ado, we're going to switch to the Iraq War panel, and so I'm asking the panelists and the moderator to come to the table. Thank you.
Vietnam War. So people may know, those of you who are old enough, many of you are not. I see some of my students in the audience. The US government lied about getting involved in the Vietnam War, as a result of which over several million people died in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, and over 60,000 US soldiers also died. And unfortunately, if we don't know history, we allow it to repeat itself. And so here we are barely a decade ago in the lead up to the Iraq War. And again, the US government, our leaders, lied to us. And as Jumana mentioned earlier, this led to the deaths of at least 100 and something thousand Iraqis, although the British medical journal, The Lancet, puts the figure at 650,000 Iraqis. And let's not forget the American soldiers, 4,000 plus, not to mention the hundreds, the tens of thousands who've been injured and suffered psychological trauma. And so part of what we're trying to do at today's teach-in is to actually bring truth about these crimes that our government is responsible for. And frankly, we're not just singling out Condoleezza Rice. We're trying to hold the entire administration accountable for these actions. And she has had opportunity, ample opportunity, to come out and come clean, to apologize if she wants to the Iraqi people, to the thousands of US soldiers and their families. but she hasn't done so, and so we feel it is our responsibility to hold her accountable. And I want to say very quickly before I introduce the speakers that the students and the faculty who have been involved in raising our voices against this particular choice have been attacked quite, vehemently by the right-wing media. First of all, we've been attacked saying that it's a bunch of white men trying to silence a black woman. White men, right, who look like me. Frankly, this is not about gender and race. In fact, if you look at the students who were involved in these protests, who played a key role in Dr. Rice's decision to not come here, extremely multicultural group of people, and I'm happy to see many of them here. So this is not about race and gender, this is about principle. Second, this is not about free speech either. This is not any old speech that Dr. Rice was going to come and give, at which we could have all of us challenging her on her record. This was a commencement speech. This was about honoring her with an honorary degree and saying that she is somebody who's a role model for our students. We took a principled stand against that, and we said that we do not support somebody who has not only lied about the Iraq War, but who has condoned torture and given the green light to torture. So, and that was the third criticism that we got, that this was partisan. This was about, being anti-Republican. Absolutely not. We took a principled position. And so no matter which administration was involved in this war, in the torture regime, we would have spoken out against it. And, I've been asked in the media, would you have done this if this was Hillary Clinton or this was Obama, what have you? Absolutely. And what we heard Jumana Musa saying earlier is that, in fact, the Obama administration has not held anyone accountable for the torture regime. And we should criticize that with as much gusto as we criticize the Bush administration. So this is about principle. And finally, I think the university really is the last bastion where you can have open and honest debate about the direction that this country is going in. And that is what this teaching ultimately is about. I'm a professor of journalism. I know there are journalists in this room. I want to challenge you to please get out of the framework that the mainstream media have set around this issue, bashing us about free speech, about racism, and take up the real issues that we are trying to raise at this teach-in. The Iraq War and lies, torture, extraordinary rendition, the formation of a national security state that systematically violates our civil liberties right here in this country and breaks international law abroad. This is literally what the future of this country is going to be, and I challenge you to report on things that are important in terms of the direction of this country and where we want to go. That is ultimately what we are trying to do with this teach-in, and that is why we raised our voices against Dr. Condoleezza Rice. So with that done, I am going to hand it to the first of our three speakers on this Iraq panel. The first is going to be Professor David Fonglin Song. He's a professor of history here at the New Brunswick campus. He has received a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He's been here at Rutgers since 1991, and he teaches and researches on topics such as U.S. foreign policy, American-Russian relations, religion, propaganda, military occupations, and he's currently working on a history of U.S. experiences with so-called nation building since 1898. So our first speaker will be Professor Fonglin Song. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Is the microphone working? It's not working. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. First of all, what a great turnout. There were some who wondered after Condoleezza Rice's withdrawal whether many people would show up. And I think it's a very heartening, encouraging sign of a depth of interest and concern about what happened during the Bush administration and a determination that it be remembered and not brushed away through some exercises in image building that you're all here this evening. The story of Condoleezza Rice is a great American success story. The rise of a black girl from Birmingham, Alabama, to prestigious and powerful positions at Stanford University and in Washington, D.C. That's apparently the main reason that she was invited to be the Clinton speaker. But the story of Condoleezza Rice is also a story of failures. A terrible intelligence failure, of course. Failures in planning. Failures to take responsibility. Failures in coordination. And most relevant to our panel, failures to be honest and candid with the American people as she participated in selling the war against Iraq. The latter failures stemmed, I think, primarily from her devotion not to a consistent set of ideas or principles, but to the pursuit of her own success and power. Many, many years ago, when I was a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley, participating in the Berkeley-Stanford program in Soviet international behavior, I periodically encounter junior professor Condoleezza Rice at seminars of the Berkeley-Stanford program. I didn't become her friend. I didn't even get to know her personally. But I was very much impressed by how bright she was, by how poised and articulate she was. And she was at that time moderate, not a crusader, not an ideologue, and her early published work on Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union was careful, well-grounded, balanced, with a proper respect for historical evidence. Already in the 1980s, though, you could sense that she was extraordinarily ambitious, that she had a powerful drive that would take her beyond the academy and into government and politics. As she took positions in the Pentagon, 1986 to 87, on the National Security Council staff, 1989, 1990, on the boards of Chevron and other major American corporations, and as a foreign policy advisor to presidential candidate George W. Bush, she of course grew more conservative and staunchly Republican. Yet through the 2000 campaign, she continued to advocate pragmatic, cautious, sober, quote, realist, end quote, policies. At the beginning of 2000, for example, she published a widely read article in the establishment journal Foreign Affairs in which she criticized most of the Clinton administration's military interventions, declared that the U.S. military was not designed for nation building, and argued that a new Republican administration should refocus on the U.S. national interest. But then, as National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, she first made misleading statements that helped to sell the war against Iraq. Second, disregarded expert judgments that conflicted with the Bush administration's drive to justify war. And third, promoted an overblown ideological justification for a global interventionist foreign policy. Rice made her most infamous misleading statement, which our keynote speaker mentioned, on CNN on September 8, 2002, when she claimed that aluminum tubes recently shipped to Iraq were, quote, only really suited for nuclear weapons programs, disregarding the doubts of Energy Department nuclear experts that they were intended for that purpose. Then, in the highly inflammatory line, Rice declared that the United States could not wait for absolute certainty about Saddam Hussein's alleged nuclear weapons program because, well, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. In the same month, September 2002, Rice made her most important contribution to the ideological justification for war. Her office promulgated the National Security Strategy of the United States of America, which contained her favorite formulation, that the United States would use its unrivaled strength to, quote, promote a balance of power that favors freedom. The statement opened with the sweeping assertion that the great struggles of the 20th century between liberty and totalitarianism ended with a decisive victory for the forces of freedom and a single sustainable model for national success: freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. That heady, triumphalist, Cold War triumphalist, end of history perspective seems to have contributed to the euphoric exaggeration of U.S. power and influence, which figured in the Bush administration's disastrous underestimation of the difficulties of the occupation of Iraq. After replacing Colin Powell as Secretary of State for Bush's second term, Rice continued to champion democratic state building as a national interest and an American mission. While still claiming the mantle of a realist, Rice embraced the universalist idea that no culture was an insurmountable stumbling block to the global mission of the United States and its allies. The question is, what happened to Rice? How to explain the change? The first explanation that she's offered herself is 9/11 changed everything. I think there must be something to that. The shock undoubtedly spurred some reorientation. It's difficult to imagine her before 2001 glibly conceiving of Afghanistan as part of an arc of opportunity, her phrase, where a U.S. military campaign could dramatically transform the entire region. But that seems at best an incomplete explanation. A second explanation that's been offered is that her deep religious beliefs contributed to her acceptance of George W. Bush's crusading approach after 9/11, and her Calvinist faith in predetermination, led her to believe that developments were part of God's plan. The trouble that seems to me to be is that her religious faith had coexisted with a realist approach or realpolitik approach for many years before 2001. A third explanation is that Rice's resentment of racist condescension she experienced in the United States led her to oppose racist denigration of Arabs as unfit for democracy. The trouble with that, it seems to me, is those factors had not affected, again, her realist approach from the 1970s to the 1980s and on into the 1990s. Her reorientation came later. So above all else, Rice seems to me to have been swayed by her intense loyalty to George W. Bush and by her own political ambition. In short, the president she served wanted to take out Saddam Hussein, and Rice was ready to set aside honesty, candor, and sober thinking about foreign policy in order to promote the fulfillment of his objectives. If we look at the history of U.S. foreign policy over the last 120 years, it's not very unusual for a government leader to make false, misleading assertions and propagate overblown ideological justifications. But considering Condoleezza Rice's start in the academic world, one might have expected something better from her. And her record in relation to the Iraq War especially certainly does not make her the kind of inspirational model one would hope to see in a commencement speaker. Okay.
Is this working? Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Our next speaker will be Dr. Charles Habel, who is the chair of the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literatures. He's an associate professor as well. Charles was born and raised in New Jersey. He's a local. He received his PhD from Harvard University, and his primary research focus has been on languages in the Middle East, both ancient and modern, as well as ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities from the East.
Thank you very much, Eva. I come before you as the chair of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literatures, which is the department in which we teach Arabic language and literature, among many other wondrous things. I've been tasked with explaining to you why I would appear here on a panel on the Iraq War. And that's a really long story. My story begins, as I would imagine many of yours does, down the shore. I grew up in a place called Asbury Park. And like a lot of kids growing up in the 80s in New Jersey, I had a brief flirtation with the occult. Now, my mother was a school teacher, and she was no dummy. She saw this interest and attempted to channel it into something productive, something academic. She had ambitions for me to go to school, basically, to come to a school like Rutgers and maybe even become a professor and teach one day. So what she did was to purchase a copy of the British Museum catalog of incantation texts and present it to me on my 9th or 10th birthday. I can't quite remember to this day which it was, but I read that catalog of incantation texts from cover to cover. And the thing that to this day remains in my memory was a description of a people were to be found on the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a people known as the Mandayans in English, or as the Sopa in Arabic. These people were the last remaining disciples of John the Baptist and preserved within their ancient scriptures his secret teachings. Now the word Mandayan in Aramaic means one who knows, and what they know is almost as fascinating as who they are. They claim that the world in which we live may have been created by the one true God, but it was a world that is controlled by the forces of darkness, chief among them the ancient Babylonian divinities, Marigal and Shamash, and all these crowds, who float above us in crafts which they identify with the planets, and interfere from time to time in the affairs of mankind. And when we die, we go to these places of detention, where we are tortured and detained until such time as we pass into the light world. And this really struck a chord with me as a child. I never, ever imagined, even at the time, and I really, really wanted to pursue this, that I would even encounter these people. But indeed, I did have an opportunity when I went to grad school at Harvard. I was asked to help organize a world congress of this very community, and it struck me even more unusual, even more outstanding, was that some of these members had by then began to trickle into the United States and take up residence in, among other places, my own beloved New Jersey. This is the vanguard of the community that later took up residence here on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And so I did, among other things, I received a proclamation from Mayor Thomas Menino to rename the Charles River the Jordan for the day so they could conduct their traditional baptisms on its banks. And I found housing for their priests, who are unable to drink water from a tap, but must drink only running water. So they had to be located in close proximity to the river, which I can tell you in Boston is not an easy proposition. So I did all these things, and afterwards this community, which those of you who share my enthusiasm, my love for the region and its peoples will know that you will never encounter a group of people more hospitable, more warm, and more giving of themselves than the people in the Middle East. And they welcomed me into their bosom and encouraged my interest in their culture and in their language. And the final results of my doctoral research was a book, a grammar of their language, which to this day is still spoken by only about 300 people, and they continue to decline every day. So this brings me to a period when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, and at this point I had actually relocated to Queens, to the center of the community that was in the U.S. at that time. And I was living in close proximity to this community and visiting with them almost every day. And it was then that the Iraq War began, a war that was begun under false pretenses, and it was prosecuted without almost any thought for what would happen after we had invaded and occupied this country. I don't need to tell you what happens to a minority group in a country that is broken. Many of you are here because of migration from your own countries. I do not know what it's like to experience the loss of my homeland, to be thrown out into the world without a place to call home. I certainly hope that none of you do, but I know for certain many of you have had this experience. And I got to see this happen unfolding before my eyes as I was engaged in my doctoral research. And this, I don't want to say that this was disruptive, because that really doesn't do justice to what happened. I would come to the home of my informants hoping to collect folk tales or recipes or learn stories about their families. And instead I had to learn about how someone was on an operating table getting a routine surgery when all of a sudden the power went out, and when it went on 2 or 3 hours later they were dead. Or how someone was kidnapped and raped and left for dead on the side of the road. Or how someone's house of worship was bombed or perhaps confiscated and taken from them. When I began my research, there were 60,000 Mandayans in Iraq. It was the largest community in the world. It was one of the only communities in the world that was the center of gravity for the religious community. Within 3 years, that number had diminished to only about 3,000 to 5,000. 95% of that community or more had been forced to flee. They were ethnically cleansed as a result of our occupation, which we attempted to commit on the cheap. Basically, we didn't give any thought as to what would happen to this country. We didn't give any resources that wouldn't be spent on our own construction companies or perhaps in the drilling for oil. And we allowed the priceless cultural patrimony of that country to be destroyed. The objects that were in the the Baghdad Museum, in the National Library, which is burned to the ground, those priceless objects that I had been so fascinated with as a child, which were pulled out of the ground, pulled out of their archaeological context, and sold on the international antiquities market. All of these things were destroyed, and they can't be replaced. But the thing that is most troubling is that these objects can be published, they can be documented, there are others like them. This community can never be replaced. This is part of the original cultural patrimony of mankind. Their sacred writings, their religion, their faith, it's of interest to us all. It belongs to all of us in a sense. And it has been scattered. And I fear very much that those who have survived the kidnappings, the assassinations, the rapes, those people who were broken, will not be able to pull their lives together in this diaspora. And even those who have, they are going to be tasked with the almost unbelievably difficult task of rebuilding their culture and their faith in a foreign land. And being so small in a country like the U.S., they may not be successful at that. And I will say that their problems did not end there. Of those countries that participated in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, none of them opened their doors to this religious minority. Many of them attempted to flee to Australia, where some of them had families, and they were arrested, and they were placed in camps in places like Papua New Guinea and Christmas Island. They were not given asylum, and to this day, this community has not been given an opportunity to reconstruct itself, but it certainly hasn't returned to Iraq. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker is Professor Toby Jones. He's an associate professor of history here at the New Brunswick campus. He's a historian of the modern Middle East, and his research focuses on the political intersections between science, technology, the environment, knowledge production, state formation, war, and Islamism. And he's the author of an excellent book, Desert Kingdom: How Oil and Water Forged Modern Saudi Arabia.
So I owe Rutgers students an apology. I think it's become a familiar lament on college campuses, especially in departmental meetings or perhaps around the margins, that university campuses have become apolitical spaces. I am the product of a deeply conservative, white, privileged university in Alabama. I then went on to another deeply privileged, not so white, but still pretty elite institution at Stanford, and I'll come back to Condoleezza Rice and Stanford at the close of things. But so I'm socialized in many respects to have low expectations for not only campus radicalism, but for political engagement at all. So this is spectacular. And it's remarkable. It's remarkable because Rutgers faculty and Rutgers students, independently but with a shared spirit, managed to accomplish something that I don't think anybody outside the university thought they could do. So thank you, and again, this is my way of, I think I need to step back and reevaluate some things. It's impossible to teach the Iraq War in 10 minutes. The students who I've had the privilege to teach and here at Rutgers know that this often occupies 5 or 6 lecture periods, 80 minutes, 480 minutes, that's a lot of time. I teach an entire class on the Iraq War. There is a lot of substance that deserves scrutiny. I don't have time to get into any of that, and I suspect many of the things that I might offer to a general audience are things that most of you already know. So I'm going to do 2 things. One is I'm going to try to disrupt the narrative that even we have bought into about Condoleezza Rice and her complicity in the Iraq War, not in a way that challenges the politics or the sentiment of this particular setting, but that expands it hopefully productively. And the other thing I want to do at the very end is raise questions, not so much as offer answers, but raise questions about the role that war plays in our political discourse, which I think we should all be troubled by outside the university. But before getting into both of those things, I want to make a very preliminary but basic argument that offers up a kind of set of platitudes that I think we all know is true, but that we have to keep in mind at the center of our politics and our analysis. War is profitable. War is an engine of imperial power. It is also an engine of economic growth, especially in the United States and in the 20th century. But war is also a tremendous force for personal privilege and power. The fact that Condoleezza Rice stood to make $35,000, which is more than some of your faculty make on campus, should be astounding. By the way, she made 4 times that amount at the University of Minnesota and at the University of Arkansas, so she's raking it in on the post-war speaker circuit. In disrupting the narrative, I want to say this very carefully. This is not Rice's war. The Iraq War didn't start with Condoleezza Rice. It didn't start with George Bush. It's rooted in a shifting American politics toward the Middle East that dates back at least to the early 1970s. And I'm constantly beleaguered by people who want me to take that moment of origin back even further. But for now, let's settle on the early 1970s. Energy, oil, political Islam, revolutionary politics, the arc of crisis, Soviet encroachment, those troubling Iranians, those troubling Arabs that don't control oil, but boy, they'd sure like to, have long been in the crosshairs of the politics of men like Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, the great liberal Jimmy Carter, who, by the way, is the president who signed off on arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But really, the American engagement in Iraq begins in 1991 with the George W. Bush administration. God, they're all the same, aren't they? And inasmuch as we want to connect Rice in this Bush administration back to that moment, it's equally important that we take into account those 8 years that separated those two institutions or those two administrations. The Iraq War and what happened after 2003 is as much the responsibility of Bill Clinton as it is George Bush. According to reasonable estimates, under an economic sanctions regime that Joy Gordon, a political scientist and philosopher at Fairfield University, has likened to war, over 500,000 Iraqis died from malnourishment, impoverishment, structural violence, the closing off of borders, and the isolation of a tyrannical regime that, unable to engage productively or at least to account for itself in the world, took out its anger on its own citizens. The combination of American and British bombing, along with the genocidal intent of Saddam Hussein, produced suffering for one group of people in particular, Iraqis. Saddam never threatened the United States, really didn't threaten his neighbors, and the fact that Bill Clinton sanctions and dropped bombs on Iraq rather than finding ways to ameliorate the suffering of Iraqis is as great a crime as any that we charge Condoleezza Rice with. Well, Rebecca Wittig's actually maybe you remember, in the mid-1990s, shortly after stepping down, maybe moving out of the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright appeared on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. And Leslie Stahl asked Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, he presented her with the evidence that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had died as a result of the American sanctions regime. And Madeleine Albright said she thought the cost was worth it, that American strategic interests were served, and that they needed to be served. From 2003 to 2011, as Deepa mentioned at the outset here, another 150 to 500,000 Iraqis in the course of the American war and occupation. The last American troops withdrew at the end of 2011, but the Iraq war is not over. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has recently re-engaged, wages a murderous campaign not only in the Iraqi countryside, but has moved to Syria, where it has engaged in skirmishes and serious political battles, not only with the Assad regime, but with rival Islamist factions backed by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, our best in the region that don't start with the letter I. Iraq has seen more bloodshed in the last 2 years than it had in the previous 2 years. In addition to all of this, Iraq is a devastated country with a hollowed out infrastructure, isolated politically. Over 2,500 tons of toxic radioactive material was dropped on both southern and central Iraq over the course of 10 years, including uranium, which will threaten and poison Iraqi generations to come. We have to keep this frame of the long war in mind when we want to make sense of figures like Condoleezza Rice, how they profit, as well as remind ourselves that in spite of our interests in this room, and the reason that most of us are here, and hopefully some of you are here to challenge us, but I imagine most of you are not, we don't really talk about these things anymore. Iraq threatens to become Korea, a terrible, bloody conflagration that killed probably millions of people, in which the most horrendous tactics of war were employed. And yet we don't think about it. How is it possible that war can be bracketed off and normalized? And how is it possible that whether it's Condoleezza Rice or Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton or George Bush or Henry Kissinger, that an institution of higher education doesn't ask that question first when it thinks about its commencement speech? I continue to be there. No, I have a great deal of privilege, and I've been very fortunate and lucky not only to write for academic audiences, but also to write for general public audiences across a wide range of media. And so in many ways, the kind of complaint that I'm going to offer now is one that threatens to sort of decenter me. And I've had lots of opportunities. But there are a lot of people who have not had opportunities to have their voices heard, to be critical, to make controversial or provocative arguments. In fact, I think I'm a bit of a token, because I often argue things that are seen as so far outside the norm that it's fun to bring me in periodically and see what I'll say. But that's a kind of privilege. What's more remarkable to me is that a collection of people, policymakers and journalists, Condoleezza Rice on the one hand, the good liberal champion Tom Friedman on the other, who have yet to be right at all, and yet continue to feature at the center of our political discourse. What is it about politics in this country that rewards not only complicity, but mediocrity, that we hold these kinds of figures up, and that attending to the possibility that Condoleezza represents what's most successful in her story, a woman who emerged from, I spent a lot of time in Alabama. This isn't a happy place. In fact, I've traveled quite widely. I often liken Alabama and Mississippi, where I've spent a great deal of time, as the scariest places I've ever been. So Condoleezza Rice's personal journey out of Birmingham is commendable. But in criticizing us for not being attentive to questions of gender and race, closes off the possibility that Iraqis have race, and that Iraqis have gender, and that those things matter too in a broader set of discussions than how we talk about. I'm going to close with an anecdote that gets, to some extent, to what David closed with as well. When I was a graduate student at Stanford in the late 1990s, I arrived in 1998, fresh out of Alabama, and my advisor, who was one person teaching Middle East history in the Stanford History Department, that placed with an endowment that's probably similar to the budget of the state of New Jersey, it had the resources to build what it wanted to build. Condoleezza Rice was provost. My advisor went to Condoleezza Rice at some point and asked her, shouldn't it be that a university like Stanford funds a more robust Middle Eastern studies program, a place that arguably occupies a position in American policy and geopolitical and strategic thinking that merits all of this money we spend on protecting it and securing its oil? And Condoleezza apparently, reported by my advisor, said, the Middle East just isn't that important. That probably tells us all we need to know about her in this constellation of experts and inexperts. I'll stop.
now, not just with questions. Certainly, by all means, we welcome questions. But if people have comments or disagreements, you are welcome to make those as well. I will time you because we have a large number of people in this room, and I want to make sure that everyone who wants to speak gets a chance to do so. So please raise your hand, and I'll keep a timeline. The woman in the black t-shirt.
Hi. First, I want to give a salute to all the students and the faculty who did something very righteous on behalf of humanity. A number of people have talked about how if Obama ought to prosecute for war crimes against Condoleezza Rice, or how what Clinton did in the first Gulf War was at least as criminal as what the Bush regime did. And I couldn't agree more. So I guess the comments I want to make is that I think we have to confront that Condoleezza Rice and these war crimes and crimes against humanity are not an anomaly or an affront to so-called the great essence of America. They actually concentrate what this country is about, which is a criminal empire, an imperialist empire. It was founded on slavery and genocide, and it continues to dominate and exploit and drone and torture and sweatshop and destroy the planet on a mass scale. And so I want to challenge people here to follow through the implications and actually consider we need a revolution, a real revolution. And WMDs were not the only thing we were lied to about. People have been lied to about real revolution and real communism. And I want to invite people this Saturday, there's an event, May 5th in New York City, where we are in the revolution. It's a serious discussion of strategy, which I think people need to get into, how a real revolution could be made in a country as powerful as this one. So I want to, invite people and offer that as a comment. Thank you.
Floor is open. Yes.
I have a comment. Going into Iraq opened the Pandora's box, which I don't think can be closed, especially in terms of sectarianism. And not only Iraq, but this sectarianism is destroying the Beirut, is destroying Karachi. We're not going to see the end of the Shia-Sunni fight in our lifetime, and I don't think it will ever stop. The car bombings in Beirut will continue. The target killings in Karachi will continue, and there's no sign of peace. All because of Condoleezza Rice and Bush.
We'll take a couple of questions and comments and then throw it back to our panelists.
Hi, Ed Kastner from the Chemistry Department. I'd like to ask if any of the panelists would care to follow up on the point that was raised by our first speaker about international or global jurisdiction for crimes against humanity, and whether there are any organized or grassroots movements that we might do well to learn about tonight.
Yeah, on sectarianism, yes. I mean, this deserves a much longer response. I'm a historian, so I try to be careful not to say nothing ever ends, because it will, but I'm sure we'll see other things. There are also lots of regional actors who profit from pitting Shia against Sunni, and so the Americans, I don't think the Bush administration was smart enough. Although there were lots of advisors telling them things that should have known better, that didn't, to know what it was getting into. But certainly, sectarian violence is a terrible concept. But yeah, there is, as far as I understand, there's an international norm. I don't know if it's a legal practice or not, where people like Pinochet can be held accountable depending on who issues the warrant. But there are also legal mechanisms by which war criminals can be at least brought to the attention of the International Criminal Court. Jurisdiction is a funny thing. The U.S. isn't a signatory on the International Court of Justice, so that's a problem. Whether or not Condoleezza Rice can travel to Paris and be safe is one thing compared to whether or not she travels to Palestine and is in Iraq. Right. So much of this is situated. There are lots of movements that would like for us to be engaged in bringing justice to these people. They're worth pursuing.
I'd like to ask Professor Jones if he can maybe briefly comment or discuss the relationship between Condoleezza Rice's tenure at Chevron and what happened when she got into the Bush administration.
Do people hear the question? The question is the relationship between Condoleezza Rice's tenure in Chevron and then what happened after she joined the Bush administration. Chevron, the oil company. We'll take some more questions and then throw it back. Others?
Yes, I have a statement or a question, I don't know. When Bush Sr. was president, correct? The towers got bombed, didn't fall, you know, there was some connection with the FBI and the persons that were involved with the bombing. And then, who was president after Bush Sr.? Whatever.
Clinton.
And then after that was Bush Jr., right?
Right.
And, you know, the towers got bombed again, they fell. And my problem is, like, mathematically, how is that almost, that can't be a coincidence that a father is president that we voted for, and then sooner or later, son comes in, we vote for, and the towers go down, and all this happens. So that's just more than coincidence. And also for the gentleman with linguistics, language, is it true that the English language is an equivocal language?
Physical? What do you mean by that?
No, I'm saying, is the language itself defined as an equivocal language?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with this term.
Alright, I looked it up. It said equivocal means underhanded, sneaky, double meaning, with intent to cause hurt. You know,
The English language.
well, no,
I don't really like attributing motives to languages. They're not people.
no, I understand, but I looked it up, and that's the dictionary is looking for. Also, I think it was Harvard professor, president, that said the world is run by words and symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, in order to make word, of course, you have to spell it. Is that correct?
Okay, we'll take one more question or comment and then throw it back to our panelists.
Everyone, I just wanted to follow up on one thing more that Jamal was talking about. She mentioned that I worked with her on behalf of Amnesty International as legislative coordinator for New Jersey. And one of the actions that we have going now that we could really do take to make a difference is closing Guantanamo. A big barrier to that is the National Defense Authorization Act as written. And there's an amendment to that by Representative Adam Smith to the fiscal year 2015 NDAA HR 4435. And you should call your representative and tell him, if that's all there is in New Jersey, we don't have any female representatives, tell him to support this amendment to allow the transfer of detainees out of Guantanamo so Guantanamo to be closed, and all detainees should either be tried in a federal court, fair trial, or released. Thank you.
On the question of Condoleezza Rice and Chevron, so I don't know enough about her particular. I mean, she had a super tanker named after her, didn't she?
Yeah.
Which is wow, what a great privilege. Yeah, look, I mean, it raises broader questions about energy and oil companies and American power, particularly in the Middle East. I mean, Dick Cheney, of course, has a distinguished history of running Halliburton and fleecing not only Americans but lots of people globally. I mean, equally troubling to the role of oil in American intervention in the Middle East, of course, is that the Bush administration closed off any close, investigation into the oil company's complicity in lots of things, as well as closing or exempting fracking and energy drilling in this country from water protections. So there's a whole thing, the whole set of things that are problematic around the question of energy. I will say this, I mean, at the heart of the current work that I do is addressing the question is what is the relationship between energy and U.S. war in the Middle East? And I push back against the argument that the U.S. went into Iraq to secure Iraqi oil fields. I think that's the wrong way to see this. I think the better way to see oil and energy and the way the Americans calculate their role in the region is that they like the autocratic, stable oil producers like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Qatar and the Emirates that have successfully produced oil and helped not only themselves but also American oil companies profit from all of this. And that the U.S. priority in the region is not so much grabbing and controlling oil as it is protecting a network of energy producers who are on their team. And Condoleezza Rice's, personal connection, I think, and Dick Cheney's, George Bush's, underscores how deeply rooted energy is in American political calculation, more generally. And I think that's where I'm comfortable leaving it without saying anything specific about Chevron.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to argue with the proposition that the world is governed by words and symbols. I would say in many cases, very often, actions speak louder than words, and that's certainly the case with Condoleezza Rice, who walked the walk and talked the talk that we all expect from a leader, and particularly in regard to what you were saying about torture, as Jemana Mosa so aptly pointed out. But when you actually look at the record of her administration and its legacy, you can clearly see that she was saying one thing and doing quite another thing. I did want to have an anecdote. When I was first hired to teach here at Rutgers, this is in 2006, I actually earned a salary that was equivalent to what Condoleezza Rice was being paid for that one speech that she was about to get. And my boss at the time, who was many things, and I won't talk about him, but he did give me an anecdote about an encounter he had with none other than Paul Wolfowitz. Now, Wolfowitz, and he had a meeting, and he had the opportunity to ask him, you remember Paul Wolfowitz, he was the head of the World Bank, before that he was Secretary of State, and Defense, I'm sorry, Defense, Undersecretary of Defense. So he was deeply involved in this war, in its planning and its commission, and my boss had an opportunity to ask him, well, you went in, you must have known what was going to happen. You had all the intelligence. Why did you drop the ball? Why did you allow this country to become a disaster? And he said, and I think his response to Hushang was very revealing, we gave those people their chance, and they blew it. Fuck them. That's really how we view this. He said they had an opportunity to make something better of themselves, and we actually gave them a boost by invading their country, destroying its infrastructure, privatizing all the state-owned industries that existed. We gave them the running start they needed, and they blew it. And so that's exactly the sort of planning that they had planned for when they created this disaster in the first place. And unfortunately, a lot of people fell through the cracks.
I'm going to say a quick thing about language and doublespeak as well, and the sort of Orwellian way in which, black becomes white and white becomes black. Yesterday I was on a television interview and they played a segment from Karl Rove. Again, Karl Rove has been, hyperactive around this issue. And he comes out and says, these are just a bunch of left-wing professors at Rutgers who are beating a dead horse about lies in the Iraq war. In fact, the Bush administration has been exonerated in relation to the Iraq war. And I thought to myself, Rove is probably the only person who can lie about lies. Right? It is incredible because there has not been one weapon of mass destruction that has been found in Iraq, not even one that they planted, and somehow unearthed. And yet here's this man, 10 years after this war, basically telling us, that the Bush administration has been exonerated for all the lies that it told. But actually, it's quite telling. I've done some research about media coverage of the Iraq war and wars in general, and the entire approach that they take is if you repeat a lie loudly enough and many times, it becomes a truth. And so never mind that there actually is no proof of the argument that you're actually making. You just have the loudest voice because you have access to the mass media and all the rest of it, then it becomes true. So I'm really glad that we're having a forum like this where we can call out these lies, and not allow them to pass. So we'll take another round of questions, a final round, and then throw it back to the panelists, and then we'll move on to the next one.
I just have a quick question. Toby, you said that war was these like modern wars in the 20th century, 21st century are imperially based and profitable. And I just want to kind of push back on that and ask, how is the Iraqi war profitable, certainly for some, but generally, especially for the United States government, a profitable enterprise?
Can we just take one or two more, and then we'll have the last comment, 2 minutes each. One more question, anyone? Last chance.
I actually have a question, but
Yeah. What is depleted uranium and how is it used as a weapon?
maybe it's a naive question, but it's something that's always puzzled me. What did Condi? This is for David. Sorry, this is for David Poston. Do we know what did Condi see in George Bush?
One last question there in the corner. Maybe just speak up.
You think I can? I just wanted to say something about the question that came up before about what happened, what was so profitable about this. I mean, it seems to me, on the pure level of who made money, we certainly can see that the oil companies, but frankly, the whole language of privatization, of gutting of pension funds, of the destruction of the conditions of not least of all, workplaces like this university, where there are 20,000 unionized workers, falls at the feet of the so-called war on terror. I mean, the fact that you have part-time lecturers at this university teaching 8 courses in one semester, making $28,000 a year. Part of the justification for that was we had to spend the money abroad. Part of the justification for the obliteration of the environment and the fracking fiasco that's going on in this country that they say is game over among the environmentalists falls at the feet of what, this endless seeking out of energy sources that is now, becoming a reason for destroying even our own environment. I think this has been enormously, it's not me thing. Look at The Economist, look at Business Week, look at the Wall Street Journal. There's like 80 people in the world today with more wealth than half the planet. This war was enormously profitable for the 1%. It's simply not even debated in the pages of the business section. So I really don't feel that
Yeah. Wow, I don't want to follow that. That's fantastic. Zach, I just want to remark this. I'm largely supportive of it. You can't bracket off the sum. The sum matter tremendously. I mean, it is precisely who profited from Iraq that needs to be interrogated very closely. When I was at Princeton a few years ago on the Energy and Oil Initiative, I had a colleague there named Roger Stearns, a political scientist, and he uses formulas and math, and so I don't understand what he does, but I understood the bottom line. He estimated the total cost of American force projection in the Middle East. So money the U.S. has spent on positioning its security and military assets in the region between 1976 and 2006, not including the cost of 1991, not including the cost of Desert Storm, not including the cost of Afghanistan. To take the 3 wars out of the equation, over 4 decades, $8 trillion the United States spent in keeping its Navy and military in the Persian Gulf. I mean, who's profiting? Somebody's profiting. Not us. Oh, about these.
Spending about $690 billion a year. The war is on and on. Who's getting that money?
It also radically recalculates how we think about the real cost of oil. Right? I mean, we're paying for it. What would healthcare cost? What would a single-payer system cost? Not that.
On the specific question about what did Condoleezza Rice see in George W. Bush, someone so deeply ignorant that he would be just an open well into which she could pour her knowledge, someone she could tutor, and someone through whom she could rise in influence and power, building on her previous relationship with the George H.W. Bush circle going back into that administration. I did want to make a brief comment following up on Charles's mention of the Wolfowitz phrase, which I hadn't heard before. I hadn't heard that before. These people, we gave them their chance. Well, Bill Clinton, to come back to a point about continuities across administrations and across political parties, Bill Clinton said more or less the same thing in September 1994 when he explained to the American people why the United States was on the verge of intervention in Haiti. And said, it's not going to be our responsibility, a nation-building project, a reconstruction project. We're going to go in, get the dictators out, and then it's going to be up to the people of the country and the international community to deal with the problems. And there's a broader point to be made there that there's a very long history of the United States intervening militarily around the world. Comes back about 100 or 120 years, and then shrugging off responsibility for the consequences for the local people, whether that's overt intervention, as in Nicaragua in the late 1920s, or covert intervention, as in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, and the list goes on and on and on. But the fundamental dynamic of we did something good, we gave them their chance, they blew it, it's their fault, and here we come back to the question about racial characterization of stereotypes about national character.
I'm just going to say one last thing before we turn it over to the next panel, and that is I hope this is not the end of the conversation about this very important issue. This is the beginning of a conversation that's really important for all of us to have. All of us teach classes about the Middle East, about U.S. foreign policy. I happen to be teaching one in the fall called Mediating the Middle East, which is about racism and the way in which brown people are demonized in order to justify U.S. policies. So if you want to fly, please take it. But the last thing I'll say is this, and that is that it's not enough simply to take classes or to come to teach-ins like this. It's what we do in the real world that actually matters. I think we have made a step forward for shared governance at this university by raising our voices, by causing Condoleezza Rice to withdraw. But that's just the first step in actually challenging the direction in which this country is going. So I would like everyone here to actually go back and not only talk to people, your friends, your family, and so on, but actually think about rebuilding an anti-war movement in this country, a peace movement in this country, that actually asks the kind of questions that we've been talking about. Why is it that hundreds of billions of dollars are spent on the military when student debt is over $1 trillion? We live in the richest country in the world. We live in the richest country in the world. There is no reason why college students should not go to school, should not go to college for free. And if we had a different set of priorities, that's the kind of system we would live in. So let us continue these discussions and let us actually turn these ideas into action to create a better university and a better society. Thank you all. We'll turn it over to next.
Thank you very much to Deepa, to the panelists. Oh, indeed, yes.
This is a song about a guy who has trouble remembering. Is there a microphone?
That's it? Okay. So, this is a song about a guy who has trouble remembering. There's two sides to every story.
But I must not take around. And then they'll say, got to thinking, what a deed I had done. I grabbed my hat and away I run. I needed to run, but a little too slow. Well, they overtook me in Jericho. I was sitting on the corner, reading the bill, when along came the sheriff from Thomasville. He said, young man, it's your name Brown. You remember the night when you threw Sadie down? And I said, oh yes, sir, my name is Lee. And I heard little Sadie in the first degree. First degree and 50 degree. If you've got any papers, come and read them to me. They took me downtown, oh, dressed in black. They put me on the train and they sent me back. Sent me on back to the county jail. Where I ain't got nobody for to go my bail. And the judge and the jury, they put us down. The judge held the paper in his right hand. He said 41 days, 41 nights. You got 41 years to wear the folks.
Thank you. This song's about being honest. Honest, not modest.
Well, Silver and Molly, James had to find a motorbike. Girl, just feel special on any sunlight. Said James and Molly, I had lost you. This is like I did that. And I see you at home. In the cafe. Yes. Red hair and black leather. That's my favorite color scheme. Oh, and he put her on behind and down to Box Hill. They did ride. It said, James, in my opinion, well, there ain't nothing in this world. 52 venture in a red-headed girl. It said, James, you're at Molly. I'm a dangerous man. I've robbed many a man in my big machine. But now I'm 21 years and I'm about to make 22. And I don't mind dying but for the love of you. But it takes to break my stride. I'll give you my Vincent to ride. Come down, with Molly. Oh, son, different. They've taken James 80 from robbery. A shotgun blast to his chest, left nothing else inside. Come down, with Molly, to his dying bedside. And when she got to the hospital, there wasn't much left. He rung that road and he rung out of breath. But he smiled to see her cry. He said, I'll give you my Vincent to ride. Now, Sir James, in my opinion, there ain't nothing in this world that be 56 Vincent and a red-headed girl. Oh no, them no they agree just long too. They don't have that soul like Vincent 52. And he reached for a hand, and he stood for the keys. Said, I won't have much further, yes, for thee. I see angels and arrows, in leather and chrome. They're moving down from heaven, carrying you home. And he gave one last kiss. He died. I'm just happy she's not coming. He gave one two. I woke up and screaming.
Thank you. That's all I have. Please enjoy the rest of the teaching.
Oh, we want more.
Please give a hand to Regulus Carpenter. Okay, we immediately switch to the next panel on academic value. A few seats have become available. Please, come.
Yeah, I know.
So we are about to start the next panel on academic values. If you want to take your seat. I want to thank Regulus Carpenter for the musical interlude.
maybe while everyone is settling down, I'll introduce myself and tell you just a tiny little story. I'm Ziva Galili. I teach at the history department here in New Brunswick. And my field is Russian history. And it so happened that this spring, I was teaching a course on Russia in the West, which was supposed to introduce students to relations between and interactions between Russia and the West over many centuries. But there came the crisis in Ukraine, and I decided to scrap some of my learned lectures and spend a couple of sessions having the students read a range of views about what is happening in Ukraine and about American foreign policy in relation to Russia in the post-Cold War period. And I must say that in order to get a range of views, I had to use the European press because there's very little range of views in the American press. But that experience, again, taught me that when we teach, we don't necessarily teach only about all the history or academic questions or skills, but we get into the political issues of the day. And I think it fits this panel we are having now on academic values. I think we can all agree on the primacy of academic values in a university, and we might even agree on the central role of faculty in promoting academic values. And yet, and we have here 3 faculty members to talk about the question. I would just like to say by way of opening that one of the questions which I hope will be addressed tonight is, can we speak of academic values separately from civil, public, political, and moral values? And another question that I'm sure will come up in our speakers is, how can we, is a place of faculty in the university and their place in defining and safeguarding academic values, and in a place like Rutgers, which doesn't have a truly independent faculty governance, how can faculty engage with and be consulted on decisions and policies that have a bearing on the university, both as an academic and as a public institution? So we have 3 speakers, and the first speaker will be Dorothy Hodgson, a professor of anthropology here in New Brunswick. She gained her PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan in 1995 and came to Rutgers already that year and was promoted through the ranks here. She has served as the chair of the Department of Anthropology, as the director of the Institute for Research on Women, and she is a member not only of the Anthropology Department, but also the Center for African Studies and the graduate program in Women and Gender Studies. Her research interests are in cultural anthropology, politics of development, culture and power, gender, social theory, ethnicity, very broad. She's a winner of many prestigious grants and the author of many publications, which I will not list. So Dorothy.
Thank you, Viva. It is really a pleasure. Can you hear me? Is this on? No and yes. Is it on now? All right, I'll be close. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm really, it warms my heart to see so many students and faculty and staff here. And I again want to thank Francois and Rudy and Yuri for organizing this, and especially the panel that we're on. I think it's really important that we're here, because we're here to try to help answer one of the last questions on your list, which is, how could this happen at Rutgers? And I speak to you, as Eva said, as a professor who's been here for almost 20 years, as a former chair of my department, but I also speak to you, perhaps most importantly, as a member of what was the prior form of the Faculty Honorary Degrees Committee, and its chair of that university-wide committee in the last 2 years of its real formation. And I want to talk to you some about that history. Now, it might seem odd to go from talking about torture and war to something as mundane as process, but there's a lot of politics in process and a lot of power in process and how it operates. And so I'd like for you to bear with me, because what I want to speak to you about is this issue of faculty governance, which is, for me, not just an academic value, but it's really a principle. I mean, it's something that underlies what universities have been about and what they should be about. And I want to make clear what that is, since there's so many students here. The notion of faculty governance is that we as faculty members, that is those of us who are doing the day-to-day teaching, interacting with students on the ground, shaping curricula and so forth, that we should be at the core of deciding the policies and practices of the university, especially with regards to curriculum and teaching, but also, and now together with administrators and staff, in making decisions about the mission and the vision of the university, which is now sometimes called shared governance. That is, that we as faculty work with administrators for that, but nonetheless that we're at the core of this. And faculty governance is enabled. There's certain permanent committees and institutions here at Rutgers. The University Senate is one, the New Brunswick Faculty Council. There's faculty councils in Newark and Camden. But there's also other kinds of committees, permanent and ad hoc committees, which have elected or appointed members. And for many, many years, one of these committees was what was called the Faculty Honorary Degree Committee. I'm going to make 2 points in kind of talking to you about this older rendition of the committee. And the first is this: although the administration and many of its representatives have stated numerous times that Rice was selected, quote, following the usual process, this is simply not true. And I'm going to leave aside questions about whether or not they followed their own new process, but I would encourage you to look at some of the emails that are reprinted in the back of the bulletin that was passed out. There's a lot of things that are coming to light that suggest that even though there's a new process that I'm going to talk about, even that wasn't followed, all right? So I'm going to leave that aside, and I want to talk about the key difference between this old process and the new, which is the very constitution of that committee, of which actually there's a number of members here in the audience today. And this is the committee that was charged with and responsible for soliciting nominations, not just from Rutgers, but from the public. The public has the right to and is encouraged to solicit nominations for an honorary degree, for reviewing those solicitations, for vetting them, and for making a proposal then to a committee of the Board of Governors, and then for the approval of the Board of Governors. Now, in the past, that is, when I was involved, when Norm was involved, and he has a longer past in it than I do, the committee was composed of about 20 members. All of them were faculty or student representatives, and the faculty was chaired by a faculty member, right? There were no administrative representatives on that committee. And as I said, I indeed was the chair of that committee the last 2 years that it survived in that form. And we had, the members were elected, but there was a real breadth and diversity. They came from all 3 campuses, all different schools, different generations, senior faculty, junior faculty, and so forth. And it was, as I said, led by a faculty member, and we made these decisions. We had debates and discussions. And we took our job very seriously. In fact, for me, this was one of there's many forms of service that happened at Rutgers. This was really my favorite form of service because it seemed so central to faculty governance, to trying to think about what was indeed the mission and vision of this place that I've now called my home. It's been, my entire academic career has been here at Rutgers. So there was a call that was circulated very broadly. We met several times for hours as a committee. People were assigned, nominees to do further research, to bring back information to the committee. We had a very democratic process. We had long, hard discussions. Often we tried to seek consensus about who to move forward. If not, we did this thing we do in a democracy. We voted. There was a majority. But nonetheless, we had, very open and sometimes difficult conversations about people, about who we thought really deserved what for us was an honor as faculty and students at Rutgers. And as I said, our recommendations, both for honorary degree and commencement speaker, went on to a committee of the Board of Governors and then eventually to the Board of Governors. I want you to compare this with the new committee that President Barchi formed when he arrived. I think I can only think in the name of what he called efficiency, which radically had the effect of radically circumscribing any kind of faculty governance, and I think led to precisely the kinds of choices we saw both for Condoleezza Rice and the kind of mishmash we've seen over the past few days with Governor Keane and Eric LeGrand. So this new committee has 6 people on it. It's chaired by President Barchi. It includes Executive Vice President Edwards. It includes a member of the Board of Governors, a member of the Board of Trustees, and count them, 2 faculty members. All right, 20 people led by faculty with student representation versus 6 chaired by the president, right? So one has to wonder and ask several questions. How freely, and let me say that I know these 2 faculty members and actually very much respect them who are on this committee. I mean, but one has to wonder how freely they could be in voicing any kind of opinion or dissent when the committee is led by the number 1 and number 2 in charge of our university. One presumes that curbs the kind of open discussion and debate that we had in our much bigger committee. Secondly, if there was disagreement among committee members, how was it resolved? Because clearly if there was a vote, which I said was kind of the end result of our process if we couldn't reach consensus before, the faculty members were outnumbered, right? There were 2 of them on a committee of 6. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how can only 2 faculty members represent the breadth of interests, perspectives, and diversity that is central to us at Rutgers? That, I think, is really a key question. And so the second point I want to make, and that's related to this, is about the criteria for an honorary degree and commencement speaker. And I want you to listen to these criteria in light of our fabulous speaker earlier and the previous panel about Iraq. The nominee for an honorary degree from Rutgers, first, must evidence outstanding achievement in the humanities, arts, sciences, profession, and so forth. Secondly, must, and listen carefully, must evidence distinguished service and performance in his or her accomplishments, this is the key part, that support the ideals of Rutgers and serve as an example to our students, our alumni, and society. And third, must evidence in his or her life a commitment of service to humankind. Let me reiterate these key phrases. Let me reiterate these phrases: outstanding achievement, distinguished service and performance, and again, most importantly, support the ideals of Rutgers University and serve as an example to our students, our alumni, and society, and a commitment of service to humankind. So as I said, part of our job was to recommend a commencement speaker from the pool of candidates for honorary degrees. That is, someone who met the important criteria for an honorary degree, but who we thought would also engage, excite, and inspire our students. Someone who represented for us the mission and aspirations of our university, who could serve as their role model. And so at this point, I'm going to say there's a very big difference, and this relates to something that Deepa was saying before in Jumani. There's a very big difference from inviting someone to give a talk at Rutgers in the name of academic freedom, right? I would fully support the right of anyone to come and speak on our campus in this kind of space where there can be question and answers and dialogue and so forth. And if that was how Rice has been invited, I think none of, maybe there would be people who would want to protest and engage her, but I fully believe in that right of academic freedom. That is very different than inviting someone to come receive an honorary degree and serve as commencement speaker. That is not about academic freedom. That is about someone serving as a symbol of our ideals and our values as a university and as an example and inspiration for our students. So in conclusion, I believe that this new honorary degree committee, if you even want to call it that, led by administrators with minimal faculty representation and no student representation, represents not only a severe undermining of faculty governance, one more practice of that, but I won't go there, in the leadership of the university, but also a challenge to our other related values like democracy, transparency, and freedom of speech. And I think we need to demand that the administration return to some version of that older, much more robust, representative, diverse faculty-led committee chaired by a faculty member and comprised of a broad range of faculty members and student representatives, as it was before, in order to ensure that there is a meaningful faculty and student voice in deciding who is going to be an honor and serve as an example for our students, someone like, say, Eric LeGrand. Thank you.
The second speaker is Norman Glickman, who holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania and had a rich career before he was brought to Rutgers in 1989 as the State of New Jersey Professor of Urban Planning. He is the director of the Center for Urban Policy Research, which carries out research in economic development, housing and land use, urban poverty, community development, and the like, and brings actually to Rutgers a lot of money to support this research in the form of grants from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, the National Academy of Sciences, the Ford Foundation, and others. Norman is a principal investigator, has been a principal investigator on numerous research projects at Rutgers and elsewhere. He's the author and editor of many books, reports, articles. Again, the list is much too long. And the recipient of an impressive list of awards and honors. So,
oh, shucks. Well, 3-4 years ago, I was to speak at a conference on community development in Newark. And I looked at the program, and speaking just before me was a very famous pastor of a church in Harlem. He was a great speaker I'd never heard before. And seeing that I had to follow him, I went to the head of the conference and I said, please, let me go first, because I don't want to have to follow this guy. Well, I hadn't thought that I'd ever have to follow our friend Dorothy Hodgson. Let me say also, it's the first time I've spoken at as a teaching since I was a junior faculty member. Can you hear me? Okay. I was a junior faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. It was at the time when Nixon and Kissinger sent troops into Cambodia. And so it's sort of fitting that I come back with talking about another person who's not our friend, and not very nice to academics like Nixon and Kissinger. I came here at the very end of Blaustein's time at Rutgers. He died only a few months after I got here, and I came to Rutgers because I saw a really bright future at the university. We were able to gain funding from Trenton. We were hiring lots of good faculty, junior faculty and senior faculty at the time. And it seemed very clear that the future was in the palms of our hand. That this was going to be, this university was moving forward and was going to continue to be great, even greater than it was then. Things are really cooking. The trajectory didn't last. Soon thereafter, Grant Lawrence came, and any of you around then know that he was no star. Dick McCormick, not much better. Both had bad relationships with the legislature. Both failed to bring in any money to help run the university. And so now our faculty and our students are much worse supported than they were then. And as Dorothy said, I served on a lot of committees. One of them was honorary degrees. I served as chairman on 2 or 3 occasions. It was a great kick. It really was a good sense of getting together, coming together, discussing different people with each other, and it was an open process. We understood from the beginning that we were not in charge of everything. We weren't calling all the shots. But when we got ideas from the president or others in the administration, they were not shoved down our throats. And we did pretty well on our own. We brought in the sainted Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, Julia Child, my favorite cook, sparkling Molly Ivins, the speaker that year. Unfortunately, she passed before she got to give the speech. She was a dear friend of mine. Musicians like Billy Taylor and Sonny Rollins, artists like Faith Ringgold, fabulous woman from Harlem, Judy Blume, Dollar Bill Bradley, a former senator, Toni Morrison, and others, including Ernesto Cortez, one of the leading community organizers in the country. And these are people that came from us after discussion with students and faculty and were accepted by the university. Then these changes took place, and Dorothy's already explained that I need to follow up on. It seems to me that the back and forth, the collegiality that we had on that committee, and that we had at the university, because his problems with Barchi go beyond just this. Okay, he's kind of a dictator. Yes, he is. Yes, he made this appointment largely without consultation with his people, right? One of them was Greg Brown, who was put on the Board of Governors by our fat governor down in Trenton, and was living on his. He was rich on his own. He didn't need anybody else, but he was put on the Board of Governors by Christie, and I think part of understanding this appointment is Christie's desire to get in better with the National Republican Party that was represented by people around our speaker or former speaker. So it was about total control, and this whole business with Eric LeBrand is particularly sad, angering. They withdrew it when they got to the press. They put in Tom Kane, who was a good guy. He was a good governor. But the process was awful. And we can't let that happen anymore. I think that, I think we need to be on the lookout all the time for other things like this, other things that are put down by Barchi and his $250,000 and more staff of administrators, who, as far as I can see, are doing nothing good for academics, for the students, for the faculty, to make this place run. They're getting paid a lot of money, not $35,000 that we heard about earlier. It's not his campus, it's our campus. So I need to hope that you will stand up and fight when you hear of other things like this, and do it often,
and do it loud. Thank you.
The last speaker is Professor Sama Selim. She's also the latest arrival on the Rutgers campus, having come just 3 years ago. She holds a PhD from the Department of Middle East and Asian Languages and Cultures at Columbia University. And her research focuses mainly on modern Arabic literature in Egypt and the Levant. She is teaching at the fairly new department here of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian languages and literature, teaching courses on the literature of the Middle East, on Arab literature, the Arab Renaissance, and she's the author of a book and several articles. So,
thank you very much. I would also like to thank Francois and Rudy and Yuri for putting this amazing teach-in together, and especially for insisting that it happened even after Condoleezza Rice had declined. Because, the mere fact that she sort of bowed out at the last minute to save face does not take care of this problem at all. As faculty member after faculty member has been sort of saying for various reasons, from the Iraq War to the extraordinary rendition and torture to the very fact that the invitation itself demonstrates a shocking lack of, transparency in the administration and the upper reaches of the administration. These are all problems that just don't simply go away when Rice, made her about face and decided not to come. So I want to thank them for that. And I also want to say that as a person who speaks 2 languages and has 2 homes and has spent most of her life living from war to war in one of, the 2 homes, between the 2 homes, so to speak. I was born in Egypt and mostly raised here in the United States, but I have most of my family is in Egypt, and as I said, I feel that I have 2 homes in the same way that I have 2 languages. So I just want to say that listening to the speakers today and revisiting the horror of that war that broke out in 2003, revisiting the horror of the Iraq War, is really it's amazing, because you think that people forget what happened, but then you realize that nothing is ever forgotten. Remembering is very, very painful. For the people who lived through that really ugly time in the United States, in the Middle East, remembering is extremely painful, but it is essential. And so one of the things I'm hoping that this teach-in has sort of, communicated to everyone who came today is that you have to remember. We have to remember. We can never forget. Okay, so this panel on university values, I want to maybe approach this question in a very sort of abstract way to begin with, by asking the question of what is the university for? Very simple, sort of, perhaps a bit vague question. Is it simply for producing CVs in a corporate job market characterized by an endless race to the bottom? Is it for producing unthinking cannon fodder for the next war in a nameless foreign country? Is it for teaching young men and women how to worship at the altar of a revamped military-industrial complex gone haywire? I think most of you will agree with me that this is most definitely not what the university is for. And yet, the administration's unilateral decision not only to invite Condoleezza Rice to give this year's commencement speech, but to honor her with the highest honor a university can give, just sent exactly that message to thousands of students and faculty at Rutgers and to the world at large. I mean, this whole situation is being followed not only by the national media, but by the international media in a really intensive way, right? The message, intentional or otherwise, was that unjustified imperial wars, torture, and extrajudicial kidnapping, the slow gutting of the U.S. Constitution, and last but not least, this is very important, The virulent neo-McCarthyism ushered in by the George W. Bush administration, and which has directly, I might add, and profoundly affected hundreds of students, of our own students, here on this very campus in the form of unabashed police surveillance, is not only okay, but honorable somehow. And of course, I'm referring to the NYPD surveillance of students here at Rutgers University, which is a direct legacy of the Patriot Act, right? The 2001 Patriot Act. Again, we have to always remember. So what is the university really for? What should it be for? In my humble opinion, in a democratic society, such as the one such as this one is supposed to be, the university's main role is to nurture the individual's ability to think critically and historically, to read between the lines of propaganda and myth, and to develop the intellectual tools and emotive resources to challenge naked power when that power threatens the well-being of social worlds within and beyond our borders. We are all human. We are not us and them, as Condoleezza Rice would have us believe. This is what humanism means. And this is why the university is known, or used to be known, as a place dedicated to the teaching of the humanities. This is why U.S. universities are known, or used to be known, as places dedicated, used to be known as some of the best in the world, right? And there's no guarantee that it will stay that way. The late, great Edward Said defined humanism as, quote, the final resistance we have against the inhuman practices and injustices that disfigure human history. And of criticism, he defined criticism, that tedious thing we teach in literature departments. He had this to say: criticism must think of itself as life-enhancing and constitutively opposed to every form of tyranny, domination, and abuse. Its social goals are non-coercive knowledge produced in the interests of human freedom. Is it a coincidence, then, that at the same time President Barchi has decided to stand firmly behind the Rice invitation, even after Rice herself thought better of it, our university, like so many others across the country, is in the process of dismantling the humanities in favor of a neoliberal corporate model of higher education? I suspect not. Critical thinking, critique, criticism in the sense used by Said are not conducive to the worship of power. I came to Rutgers in 2009 after 6 years of a kind of self-imposed exile abroad in the wake of that horrifying war that began in 2003. I came back because I missed home, and I missed a lot of things, the best things about this country, a sense of endless optimism, the kindness of strangers. But most of all, I missed the fighting spirit that the many struggles the people in this country, from the civil rights movement through to the anti-war movement, created in people, made people in this country different from people in Europe where I spent those 6 years, right? Made them believe very deeply and very fiercely in a sense of entitlement to equality and justice. I wanted to work at a public university because I believe in all the good things that the word public means. I'm proud to be part of one of the most racially and ethnically diverse universities in the country. And I'm proud that a majority of my students are bilingual, brilliant, amazingly hardworking, and know the value of a good humanist education without anyone having to tell them, by the way. But when I went and actually did a bit of research on the history of student activism at Rutgers, I became even more proud. I discovered that Rutgers was at the forefront of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, and the struggle against apartheid in this country. I learned, for example, about the New York Uprising in the 1969 student occupation of Conklin Hall to demand racial equality. a struggle that changed the face of Rutgers and opened its gates once and for all, not just to African Americans, but to the unique and thriving diversity that is this university. I learned about the 3-day occupation of Old Queens in 1970 to protest the Vietnam War, about the month-long occupation of the College Avenue Center in 1985 and the subsequent hunger strike that led to the university divesting from South Africa. And I learned about the first National Student Convention that was held on Livingston campus in 1988 to fight for, quote, equality and substantive democracy and to expose corporate and military dominance on America's university campuses. The right kind of university values are not just produced in policy papers or taught in academic syllabi. They are all about campus communities coming together in concrete struggles like these. So the events surrounding the scandalous Rice invitation are part of the same decades-long struggle. Because once again, as we see today and as we've seen over the past few weeks, Rutgers students have come together to say, we will not worship power. And I'm very proud to be part of that.
Thank you for all the speakers, and now time for questions or comments.
So, as you've laid out, this situation is inherently political. What's going on is because of the politics surrounding not only our university, but the state as well. And I feel like there's a lot of students who don't realize that what's going on is political. So how do we get that out to everybody? How do we get that out that this is a political situation? This isn't just for the commencement speech. Also, a second question on a different note. Academia, I believe education is a tool of liberation, but academia has been historically used as a tool of war as well. Academics have put forth papers and ideas that have helped colonization occur, that have helped war occur. So as academics yourself, how do you see your role in preventing that and reversing all the negativity that has occurred?
Are there other questions? We can take more than one and then answer them together.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, almost shocked that the Big Ten and athletics weren't mentioned yet. I'm a first-year graduate student here, and you know, the first thing I heard about before I came here was basketball, and then the way I've kind of interpreted this whole situation is the importance of Rutgers joining the Big Ten, which has a lot to do with TV contracts and money. And I'm just interested where faculty sees themselves in terms of also ethics and this whole type of new situation for the university.
Well, if we were listening to or read the memos that Archie sends out, there's nothing about sports that he talks about. It's all about how we get to have a piece of the academic pie that's been built out somehow in the Big Ten. You never mentioned a word about us playing football, which is the reason we've been selected, because we're in the New York market, and they wanted the New York market very badly. But that's not the story we get. It's complete phony.
And that's a very important question, and I just want to say I don't think academia is some like one monolithic thing, right? Like any institutional space, academia is a place where you have a left and a right, and you have, you have dissent, you have professors who can be part of the same broad political spectrum that you find across the country in so many different kinds of spaces and institutions, right? So the key to, the question of how to sort of fight this kind of fight on campus in the university setting, the answer is similar to what the answer would be anyplace else, which is to come together and to organize, right? And that organizing takes place across university communities, right? So, students have natural allies in faculty, and I think that there should be a lot more of that kind of coming together, between students and faculty on campus, between institutions that already exist on campus, like our labor unions, our faculty and student unions on campus, and so forth. And that's the only way to really do it. Raising awareness is a job that also takes place in classrooms, obviously. I mean, I tried to talk about that a little bit. That what we teach our students in the classroom is as important a part of how we relate to them outside of the classroom and how we engage them outside of the classroom. So it's it's a lot more simple and at the same time a lot more complex than the word academia is sort of a catch-all word might express. Can I say something about the athletics thing as well? I mean, I think that I think you're absolutely right to bring this up, and that the athletics program at Rutgers is part of the way in which the university administration is bleeding the humanities, right? I mean, there are so many departments at the university right now that are in danger of, almost in danger of disappearing because of the fact that there are absolutely no resources that are being made available to them as a result of the hemorrhaging athletics budget and the way in which the university is intent on foregrounding the importance of athletics at the expense of other
Other questions?
I wanted to. I'm sorry. So I was having this discussion with one of my classmates the other day, and from that this question comes. Considering no political figure is free of some charges, some controversy or something, not even, so is it advisable to not have someone from the political sphere as a commencement speaker in any university campus in that case? For example, if we have Obama in 2015, when Obama has Libya and Benghazi on his head. So should we actually be proposing no political figures coming to commencements of events such as commencement speaking? And in case we do that, aren't we shutting off students, graduating students, from the sphere of mainstream politics in that case? I am at a loss. When I was having this discussion with one of my friends, I was at a loss for an answer. So if I would like to know what does the panel opine on this issue, on this topic.
I think that you're making this much too simple. There's a long road between Condoleezza Rice and Elizabeth Warren. Okay? There's a long road between. There's lots of good people out there who are doing good politics, working for, trying to help working people, trying to help minorities, trying to help women, whatever, that are perfectly good people to have speak. I mentioned earlier Barbara Jordan, who's gone before many of you were born, I think, but was in politics starting in the 60s in Texas, 70s in the United States Congress. Was a marvelous human being and worked hard for people of all races, all interests, and could read the telephone book in a way that would make you cry. She had that kind of voice and that kind of power. And so there are a lot of good people out there. It's not just Condoleezza Rice and nobody. Not that every politician is a bad dude, right? So tell your friend to read some more about what's going on in this country and what's going on in this world.
This is also a question for Professor Glickman or anybody who knows about this. So you mentioned the interesting possibility, the hypothesis that Christine Pointy, Greg Brown, who's the vice chair of the Board of Governors, was interested in inviting Rice so that Christie could get in better with the National Republicans. Is there any way of documenting something like that, whether it's through emails from Christie's staff members to Greg Brown, or through conversations that took place on the Board of Governors. There's a lot of people on the Board of Governors. Some of them have seemed to me in the past to be honorable folks. Is there any way of getting access to discussions that were had on the board about this nomination? Or in the emails at the end of the program, there's a gap of a couple of weeks between when Condoleezza Rice's name was floated and when the invitation actually went out. Is there any way of getting access to emails or conversations that happened during that period? Because it's a very interesting possibility.
I think it's very difficult to get anything written down. Like the Iraq War, nothing was written down in the way that you could say, you can point a finger. The story about Craig Brown came to me from somebody up there, who I can't name, who knows the story. Also knew the story that, unlike what Archie said, this decision wasn't made last year by the Board of Governors. It was never discussed by the Board of Governors last year. It came up in February or March of this year. I don't know exactly when. No, I think it's very hard to get that story straight unless you have somebody on the Board of Governors who's willing to go rogue. And you don't get the point of the Board of Governors if you're going to go rogue. That's not who the point is. In case you've noticed, haven't noticed it.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a comment and a question. The first comment is that as a graduate of Rutgers University, got my MA and PhD in political science here, and also as someone who's been blessed to come back to be on the teaching faculty, I have been incredibly encouraged by the response that the university community has had to Rice's invitation. Right? It gives you hope, right? Because there are always, and I tell people, when I was in graduate student year, Lawrence was president. Of course, we know all of his notorious antics. So the question is, whenever we're in these spaces, well, do things happen that we have issues with? Of course they will. How do we respond? That's always the issue. So it has been really just uplifting. The question has to do with how do we revitalize a very more progressive understanding of equality, right? Particularly in citizenship, particularly in this increasingly diverse community and country that we have. And as it relates to the rights question, one of the interesting things that people have pointed out is that some folks worried about the fact that even if they didn't agree with anything that she stands for, what does it mean to request the withdrawal of an invitation to someone who's Black and female? Right? What are the implications of that? What are the politics of that? People raising questions about, well, is it easy to file vitriol against Black female bodies in general? Is it part of that? So people have some serious tensions about that. Part of what I argue, is that really, even if that is the case, I mean, there are some real issues at stake with it. Governance issues to, what this means in terms of where we go, the symbolism involved. And so I think that it's important to address that. We are going to have situations over and over again, increasingly, where you will have white women like Hillary Clinton or people of color who are in positions. If we use a liberal equality bean counting approach, well, we just say who is the first person to be X, Secretary of State, or you fill in the blank, then we just have to applaud that. But to answer the question, would we have a response to, for example, President Obama? As one reporter said, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can point out the fact that he's gotten really unprecedented amounts of resistance at the same time. He has seriously problematic politics. Bill Clinton, he has issues, right? The Democratic Party has issues. The question becomes, I'll land the plane. How do we promote a really more robust discussion about the meaning of the substantive forms of equality and more progressive understandings of citizenship that can take into account what's happening with the changing demographics and politics of it all. I think that you know, I think we would all agree that that's really important, and it speaks back to what Samal was saying about, you know, why many of us are all here as faculty members, and what inspires us to teach at Rutgers. I've often said the same thing. I mean, I've always, as I said, my entire academic career has been here, and that's not been for a lack of other opportunities. But I've always wanted to be at a place that was a public. I've been proud of the fact that it was such a diverse campus. It was a public university. There were so many first-generation students. You know, people said, well, how about down the road? That is, Prince is like, I don't want to be in that space. You know, I don't want to teach something, especially like anthropology, that's full of critical thinking and turn your world upside down in a space where everyone is kind of a bland replica of each other. I would much rather have the kinds of dynamic, difficult conversations that we have in the Rutgers classroom here, which are part of having these more engaged conversations about not equality, but about equity, not about rights, but about justice, and about these ways that, you know, go beyond the surface of gender or of race or ethnicity, but engage that.
Really, I'm talking about the fact.
Yeah.
More than anything, I know we can do it in the classroom. I'm talking about our colleagues, right? That, you know, how do we? That's something that informs this process and so much else that happens.
Right.
The classroom is that's all that.
No, I agree.
But you know who the good people are in the faculty, and you can form alliances with those folks. I think that everybody, you know, you gent in the back mentioned this earlier. It's not every. You have to find your friends. You have to help develop your friends. You have to talk with them, work with them, and that's the case with dealing with faculty, dealing with other students, dealing with your colleagues. They're there. Doesn't always work, but you got to keep trying.
I would agree.
Oh.
This ties into what Samantha was saying earlier and the first question as well, and many conversations that we've had too. This period in which the university was a node of resistance to some of the state policy really belongs to a very relatively short moment in time. And historically, the university has been, especially the public university, has been an organ of the state dedicated to producing doctors, lawyers, engineers, and other useful employees. I'm wondering if we're now seeing the sunset of that period, and whether or not it's going to revert to what it was before.
I certainly hope so. I mean, I don't know. I mean, a relatively short time. We're talking about 3 or 4 decades, right? And in the history of the university. Okay, well, you can talk about the history of the country too. As well, you know, it's not just the history of the university, right? But I was really amazed. Like when I actually sat down on the internet. Thank God for the internet. You know, we might not have it for that much longer, but I was amazed at the history that's there. It's not. They don't make it easy for you to find it, obviously. You know. And I'm not so sure that I agree 100% that the public university or the state university is a place for producing, is a factory for producing professional degrees and nothing else. I mean, I think, as I was saying earlier, I think that, all institutions are also locations of resistance, right? And especially the university, because of this sort of historic mission of the humanities, or the idea of the humanities, among other things. So I think I'm quite optimistic, actually, and I think pretty soon people aren't going to have a choice, really. It's either going to be fight or die, swim or sink. And once everybody, including students, start to realize that, which I feel they are, I feel that's happening already. I mean, look how this amazing victory, we didn't even think we were going to be able to actually arrive at this moment when we started the petitions, and when we thought we were going to fail, right? So it was amazing. I mean, in 2-3 weeks' time, we won. I mean, that's so empowering, and so amazing.
So on these encouraging words, we'll close this panel. I think we only scratched the surface, and I hope the conversations continue, but I want to thank the panelists and all of you who asked questions and made
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you for this wonderful panel. So let me just explain what's happening now. We will have the students panel, the students, and we're going to need 2 more chairs for the students panel. After that, we'll have a performance of protest songs, Spoof Handy, and then presentation of excerpts from the film Taxi to the Dark Side by Professor Richard Deans. Without further ado, let's hear some of the students whose actions essentially made Condoleezza Rice revise her project.
I'm good.
Good evening, everybody. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Stefan Roblin, who approached me last week during the protest and letting me know about the teach-in, and this way we were able to mobilize such a big crowd of students. To start off, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Hamza Nomani. I am a graduating senior, and I'm majoring in planning and public policy at the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning, Public Policy, and Health. I also want to thank Dr. Francois Cornelia. I apologize if I did mess up your name, but we were talking this morning, and he pretty much gave me the itinerary of a program. And just to let you know, everybody that's speaking today, our whole process throughout the whole No Rights campaign has been all democratic. So meaning that everything that we've done it on the voting system. So the panel that are up here, we voted upon who's going to be representing us today. And we have great lineup tonight. I want to start off with first Diala Ghanim. Diala Ghanim, she's a freshman from Abu Dhabi, so she is here in New Jersey, Rutgers for the first time. Then she's also a human resource management major along with a political science major. And then we have Amani Al-Khatatfa. I'm sure you guys all know her. I mean, you've seen her, you've heard her. I'm sure you've heard her talking before. But she's a senior, a graduating senior, and she is majoring. And it's her birthday. She is 22.
You're old.
But Amani, she's majoring in Middle Eastern Studies and journalism. Political science. Next we have Margarita Rosario, who is a junior, and she was on board with RUSA this year as well. And she is majoring in political science and philosophy. Next one is Ezra Shalom. And I met Ezra just last week, and Ezra and I we just clicked, and I'm glad that I got to meet Ezra. And he is a sophomore majoring in labor studies and criminal justice. And last is our other senior, Mr. Jim T. Schmidt, who is majoring in chemistry.
That's not my name, actually, just to clarify you.
His name is John Wazowski, but he goes by the alias of Jimmy D. Schmidt. If you want to know further about Jimmy D. Schmidt, look him up on YouTube at Jimmy D. Schmidt. So once again, I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight, for staying actually. I'm going to try to make this as entertaining as possible. We're a bunch of young students up here that are the voices of the No Rights campaign. And before I start, I just want to give the round of applause of these students that were working very hard for the whole No Rights campaign. I also want to give a round of applause to our media spokesman, Mr. Carmelo Centros Vivas, who is actually right now at Fox News doing a live debate with, you know how Fox is, but hopefully, his mind is sane right now. But he's a smart guy, and he's been representing us really well. So again, our thoughts are with Carmelo right now. So I want us to first start off. So this is going to be very interactive. I want this to be a discussion based. So I'm going to ask each one of these panels a question, and maybe if you guys have a question, we could try to tie that in together. But my first question is to Piada, and I want to ask, how did the No Rights movement start? Why was it successful? Why was it so successful? And how were people unified? And I want to know from your opinion as well as a freshman, coming from Abu Dhabi, like what differences did you see in the movement?
Alright, so hi people. Hamza already introduced me, so there's no need for me to do that.
Eat the mic.
Okay. Just to go off, I'm just gonna start first, like as a freshman and stuff, and I came from the Middle East. I graduated high school from Abu Dhabi, and we grew up in a very different environment where it's very political. So we know what's really happening, if you ask us. And after I heard personally that Rice was coming here for a commencement, be a commencement speaker, I was just talking to my friends. I was like, oh, this is really bad. She shouldn't come, blah, blah, blah. I don't think everyone knows what she did. And it was basically that's how we just started. It was just a bunch of students who did not want Rice to come. They knew about her war crimes, all that, and we just decided to go on with this movement. We thought that the only thing that could stop evil stuff from happening is for good people to actually say stop to it. Enough. It's time to stop these things. Another thing is we're all raised, all of us, even though we come from different backgrounds, we're all raised on certain morals and certain values. And we're all raised that when there's something wrong going on, we just don't sit there. We have to get up and say something about it. And that's why all of us came together and decided to start this movement. It was successful because, unlike this university, we are very democratic, and our selection process was democratic, and that's why we were successful. And we all respected each other's opinions. We all had one goal to work on. And just as I was saying, we all share the same values and morals, regardless of what your background was. And that's why, that's why we're successful.
Great. So again, how I like to reiterate that everything that we've done has been in a democratic fashion, meaning that we've been taking a vote on who wants to be a media spokesman. We voted on Carmelo to represent us to the media. We also have Amani as our backup. So everything that's been done has been done in a manner where we can't be mad at each other because we all voted for a democratic process as well too. We don't want to pull I'm not going to say any names, but the Rutgers Board of Governors where they don't listen to their people and where they don't want students' involvement or they don't want the faculty's involved when it comes down to deciding the commencement speaker. Now my next question is to Manny. Oh, sure.
When I was just telling some of my freshman friends about what I was doing and stuff, they asked me two questions, and it was like, so why are you guys doing this? There's always bad people everywhere. Everyone's gonna hate everyone. So what's the point? It's like that's exactly the point. We don't want people. It's time for us to change things, and we're starting now. Even though we're small, we're growing every day. That's one main reason why we're doing this. Okay.
Thank you, Piala.
Yeah.
So Amani, why didn't the protesters and others involved want Condoleezza Rice to deliver the commencement speech? If you're in a public university setting, such as Rutgers University, shouldn't her speaking at commencement be a way to exercise her rights towards freedom of speech? What are your thoughts on that?
Cool. Thanks for the question. Well, to start off, I really want to thank everyone that came out here. This is an amazing turnout. I didn't realize so many people were interested in celebrating my birthday today. I appreciate you for coming out. I also really want to start off by saying that I am so incredibly humbled in the presence of the people that are here tonight. Those are my peers that took part in all these actions that were straight up warriors. David's going against Goliath, and they really put up a fight that was extremely incredible. And on top of that, the faculty, who like our biggest allies for everything that we did, are the heavyweights in this room. They really were a backbone for us. Like, I know for me personally, every time that we felt like we were under threat or intimidation from the cops, like Shari became my hotline. I just like sent her a text. She'd bring the troops in.
Let's clap it up for Shari really quick.
I'm gonna start off with a confession, I guess. When I first heard that Condoleezza Rice was coming to speak at Rutgers, I was one of the people that was really happy about it. At the beginning, for me, especially growing up with the Iraq War, seeing Condoleezza Rice like on our TV screens was so inspiring to me as a woman of color. And I think that that is a testament to the fact that we do truly respect all the obstacles she had to overcome to get to the place that she's in today. This has nothing to do with race and absolutely has nothing to do with her party lines or ideologies. That's not what this is about. It's not about a party. Human rights are not a partisan issue. And I think that's something that everyone here truly believes in order for us to make this happen. The thing that made it change for me, I guess, from my initial like happiness about her coming was me relearning the policies that she was complicit in and the actions that she was responsible for. The fact that she was the first official to okay waterboarding, that she sponsored so many other torture tactics, that our university was willing to honor her with an honorary law degree for blatantly violating international law was something completely unacceptable. Just the fact that she was invited to speak, in the first place was an honor. The fact that she was going to be our commencement speaker was giving us the message, especially for me as a graduating senior, that she embodied all the values that we were to aspire to, that she was a role model for us. And that's something that was absolutely unacceptable and completely adjacent to the morals that we hold here at Rutgers University. And I think that's really what drew us together about this issue. Most of all, it's really important to point out and recognize that what took place here was history being made. We made history by having her back out of this commencement speech because we sent a clear message to our public officials. The reason why all this media is being riled up right now is because they're scared. They know that young people are still remember, and we're not going to forget. They know that they have people that they have to answer to, and that they will be held accountable for their actions. That's exactly what we did here today. Even if it came from a small minority of students, good. That shows the power. And for us, it was only 1 week of civil disobedience. We didn't even get started with all the things. After the initial happiness of hearing that she backed out, we were kind of disappointed. We're like, yeah, we're not going to have the rally, we're not going to have the hunger strike that we had planned. There was so much more to come. And I think it's also important to note that all of this started with our vote at RUSA to rescind her invitation being turned down in the student assembly. And I also want to recognize that that initial vote was brought to the table by Sharif Ibrahim and Sada Zayed, who started the fight and has now taken on a life of its own. It really starts with one voice. And I think that these lessons we learned today, as a good friend of mine said on Facebook, like one of his initial responses to Condoleezza Rice's announcement, is that this speaks much louder than any commencement speech will. And this is a lesson we'll take away with ourselves.
Wow, such a powerful answer, Amani. Howard German. No, but I just also want to make a note that Amani, myself, John, and others who are involved, we're graduating seniors. So this is something that, even though I'm graduating, I'm happy that I'm graduating, but at the same time, I'm a little upset because we started this movement, and this is something that I want to see progress. And we have so many underclassmen that are freshmen, such as, we had this girl, Sarah, Ibrahim, Kareem, all these people that are heavily involved with the movement as well too. And I can see that our focus will progress, and I like the way that our vision is going towards right now. And just to see that we have so many underclassmen involved is something great, because us seniors, again, we're leaving, and we're just going to be handing it off to the younger generation. So my next question is to Margarita. So Margarita, did you take any prior steps before resorting to the sit-in? Like, what prior steps did you take?
Yeah, so before the sit-in, we actually tried to take multiple institutional steps, and surprise, they didn't work. Here I want to claim that they didn't work and they actually wouldn't work. And this is because in such institutional spaces, what is taught is that whatever you do will not change the administrative decision. This will not change the university's stance on this. So when two bills were presented in RUSA, one for Condoleezza Rice and one against Condoleezza Rice, it was actually not until we had about 70 Muslim students come to the RUSA meeting and actually tell their stories, personal stories that are still engraved in my mind as someone who did not know about these things. It was only after that 17 out of 42 RUSA representatives actually voted to rescind her invitation. That means that instead, the bill that was won to welcome her. And up to this day, the university keeps saying that the students actually want her here because the students voted to welcome her, and that is not true. RUSA is not a representative of the whole student body. And that's not to say that student governments can never enact change. This is only to say that when you have a student government who is only set on affirming the values of this administration, then you cannot enact change via those routes. And that's why we resorted to the routes that we took.
Great. I also wanted to mention that throughout this whole process, I saw two types of groups. There was people that really didn't care at all, and there was people that really cared about this whole movement. So even though that we were only about 150 people out of the large population at Rutgers University, these 150 people showed the drive that we had to make to get this action started. The whole movement of No Rights, it started because a couple of us from that same, how Margarita mentioned, from that same RUSA meeting that we had, the mock debate, and how it was overturned that our voices weren't being heard. So therefore, these 150 people that got together with the sit-ins, with the rallies and everything that happened, we were these 150 minorities that made this change happen. So I feel that this is a great a progression for us, because we were the change makers, and again, the class of 2014 made history. So the next question is Ezra. So Ezra, Rutgers has a history of student activism, and did any of those legacies have an impact on your personal involvement with the cause? So oppositions, such as the controversial Pamela Geller, she called this a Muslim radical protest or a Muslim radical movement, and she really emphasized the fact that this was a Muslim movement. So from a non-Muslim standpoint, how would you respond to it?
There's a lot of different ways to go about it. I'd also like to point out that I was also a former member of RUSA and a member of the United Left Council. And so the Rutgers has a really strong history of student activism and student power, and a lot of that had a lot of influence on this movement. Starting with the movement against racism on Livingston College in the late 70s and early 1980s, and which was really, a successful campaign that really pushed forward the active students who really cared about what happened at their university. And if you really want to see the after effects of that struggle, just look at the way that Lucy Stone Hall is built. Lucy Stone Hall, the reason why it looks like a maze and you could go here for 20 years and still not be able to figure your way around it, is because it was built to continue protests. So the police knew how to not let the protest get out of hand and get out of a certain square. And and then the next one, which I believe Selma mentioned, was the successful BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement from apartheid South Africa. A lot of those actions, a lot of things, and that successful movement had a lot of influence, I know, on me and a lot of other people in terms of the actions we took here. And that was when we did that. I mean, when our predecessors did that, you know, they didn't take calm like little protest actions. They went on a hunger strike. They had 4,500 students protesting on College Ave with Jesse Jackson speaking here. They chained themselves to the student center. These actions that they took were extremely demonstrative in getting Rutgers to actually divest from South Africa. And our former president at the time, President Blaustein, himself was arrested for blocking the entrance to the South African embassy in New York City, I believe. And then going all the way down to a few years ago in 2011, students got together to fight really, I would say, insane tuition hikes, and got through sit-ins, through walkouts, through mass mobilizations of students, were able to get the lowest tuition rates at that time in I think over a decade, maybe even 20 years, and that just leads to us. And then, you know, we as a movement got together, and because of our actions, the former Secretary of State, the former National Security Advisor, decided to back out. And I think that's a really tremendous thing that we accomplished. But something I also want to touch upon, and I think this is one of the most significant things that happened in this movement, and one of the most beautiful things that happened in this movement, is that it unified and brought together people regardless of their political beliefs, regardless of their religious beliefs, regardless of their ethnicity, race, anything. It brought all of us together, strive for a greater good. We put everything aside to get together. I am a Jew. I am a proud Jew. And everybody knows that there is a lot of bloodshed and a lot of really troubled history between Jews and Muslims, you know, the last several decades. And I can tell you here, after the past week, I have a lot of Muslims that I call my brothers and sisters. People like Pamela Geller who want to call us all Muslims, all Nazis, like whatever that is. I find that offensive because people in my family were murdered in the Holocaust. And also the fact that we're all Muslims. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's not a Muslim. I'm pretty sure I'm not a Muslim. I'm pretty sure she's not a Muslim. But this was you know, a movement that brought together people from every single corner, from every single you know, ethnicity, religion, everything. And to even demonstrate that, look at everybody on this panel. We got Humza, I'm pretty sure, Pakistan. We got Diallo here, who is from Abu Dhabi. You have Imani, who's half Jordanian, half Palestinian. You have Margarita, who's Dominican. You have me, who's Jewish. You have John here, who's all white. And that really just, looking at this, you see the unity of this movement. And it was really just inspiring and beautiful thing. Whether you supported what we did, you're against what we did, the unity of students, which is really what this university should stand for, is what happened here.
Thank you so much, Ezra. So again, to reiterate the 1985 divestment in South Africa, what we did, there was people that shackled themselves at Old Queens at the student center, and these were the same people that people were saying that nothing, you guys are not going to do anything, there's not going to be any change, you guys are wasting your time, you guys are going to get arrested for no reason, etc., etc. And they set that precedent for us to do whatever we did at Old Queens, where we didn't shackle ourselves, but we sat in, we didn't let you know, a couple of officials, a bunch of cops come in and tell us that what we're doing is not going to change anything. In fact, we did change something, and we had the former Secretary of State not come to Rutgers University. Okay, now with John Lazowski, aka Mr. Jimothy Schmidt. How do you see this movement progressing in the future? Does the movement have any plans for sustainability?
Okay, I would like to begin by by saying that just 2 weeks ago today, I was sitting outside of Scott Hall with a little Sharpie marker and a piece of poster paper saying no honors for war crimes. We had like a handful of people there. We were passing out flyers. We had this little up, and 11 days later, the former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, backed out of commencement, citing our protest as the reason. In 11 days. That is incredible. What happened in those short few days was the most ambitious, energized, and organized coalition of student activists coming together to fight for a common purpose. Before this movement, I've seen the activist community at Rutgers. It's very divided. Everyone just has their own issue that they're working on, and no one really talks to each other. Before No Rice, I had made efforts to get the different activist groups to sort of start working up. I've been trying to build bridges, but it's a very slow process. But as soon as we had that sit-in, suddenly, bam, like all eyes were on the No Rice campaign. Everyone was just coming out to these meetings. Every night, we would just be packing 50 students into these rooms. These meetings would go on for hours. It's too long, actually. But it was incredible having all of these students working on these campaigns, proposing new ideas that would be implemented just days later. And, as Ezra pointed out, people of all different beliefs, all different backgrounds. And myself, I'm openly atheist, and I'm working with all these Muslim students. And this has been a great experience for me because, even though, I might not believe in God, we've come to realize that they understand my values and I understand theirs, and I realize that there's not that much of a difference between them. We all fight for justice. We all fight for freedom, regardless of what we believe. And it's because of that the kind of discrimination we see in mainstream society doesn't exist within our movement. And we see the marginalization and demonization of Muslims every day with the hate speech that our campaign receives. I was just as much. There's been no real difference between my actions within the No Rice campaign and the actions of my Muslim allies and friends. And yet, it's the Muslims involved with this who are called terrorists, while I am merely called a terrorist sympathizer or a libtard or whatever stupid insult they want to throw at me. But all the really harsh, demonizing, dehumanizing comments are targeted at the Muslims. But those kind of attitudes, they don't exist within our movement. They don't exist within our movement. This is an inclusive movement. We respect people regardless of their beliefs, because we all know that we are all on the same side, fighting for the same purpose. So and not even just beliefs. We have this campaign has been the gender representation is 50-50 male female too. This kind of campaign defeats bigotry, defeats racism, sexism. All these different people are coming together and uniting, and we need to continue tonight. We need to continue to get all student activists on campus, anyone who is fighting for human rights, anyone who is fighting for social justice. We need all of their voices. We need all of them to come together to join us. And it's not going to end. Yes, we have achieved our goal of getting Condoleezza Rice out, but we are not done. We are not done. There is so much. This is a school. This is an administration. President Barchi has made a dedicated effort to ignore student activists. And he is going to answer to us, because now the activist community of Rutgers is united, and we are not going to be silent, and we are not going to fall apart. We are going to demand tuition freezes. We are going to demand that Rutgers stop hiring sex offenders to work with students. We are going to demand that Rutgers divest from companies that profit off of human rights abuses. We are going to demand that Rutgers divest from polluters and companies that mistreat their workers. There is nothing that we cannot accomplish. We will accomplish it all, and guess what? This will spread to every university. I want this movement will not die. We are just getting started. We're just getting here, and we are going to spread our message across the world.
Thank you.
With that, I want to say Kanji says stay back.
We say fight back.
Kanji says stay back.
We say fight back.
Kanji says stay back.
We say fight back.
Okay, well, that is the conclusion of our panel. We will be doing a Q&A session before I do my closing remarks. So there's a Q&A session, and I think we should ask the question to John since he got this the most pumped up right now.
You needed some fire in there. Some fire.
The red hair helps.
This is not really a question, it's more like a comment. The university administration keeps on saying that we did a violent protest while breaking some glass. The glass was smaller than this right here, piece of paper. So if you think that is violence, then I don't know what truly is violence.
And we're paying for it.
And we are paying for it $183.
Let me add to that really quick. So I bumped into my professor today, who also used to be the vice president for continuing education. And we're at the Blaustein School, and he comes up to me. He's like, "Hey, I saw you on the news last night, my wife and I, and they were saying that you guys had a violent protest. Let me tell you something. Back when I used to protest, we made sure it was violent. So, you know, one little cracked window, that's not violent. So continue breaking those windows."
So, hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for being on the panel.
Can you please stand up and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Mas Khan. Thanks for being on the panel, guys. John's got me really pumped up. Do you have any recommendations? I feel like going to rally about something right now.
You want to rally right now?
No, but the question I actually have is, I mean, this was a successful movement, but we sort of moved on to a bigger fight. I think everyone in this room sort of, or I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but 2016 is 2 years away, and the university's already started plans on inviting a president who's responsible for drone strikes in Yemen and Pakistan, you know, including on wedding parties, you know, on occasions of happiness and joy, you know, people are being murdered en masse. But at the same time, this individual is not a neocon. This individual is not necessarily someone who is known for being a warmonger, but he's guilty of certain crimes as well. We face a certain fight. In opposing Kandi rights, we had certain allies. We had, you know, a coalition that came together. But at the same time, you know, we might not have the same allies going forward in 2016. So what do you propose about building a strong coalition that can, you know, say no to even a liberal president as well as a conservative president?
Hi, my name is Mazhar. You kind of all know me. And I was wondering, like, now that we got Condoleezza Rice, we kicked her out of our premises. So what about getting Barchi and democratizing the selection process with the board of governors? Like, how should we go ahead with that? And yeah.
Well, in regards to Barack Obama being invited to speak here in 2 years, I think the problem lies in the question itself. He's already being invited to speak here. Did anyone in this room vote on that? Were any of you approached about it? Did any of you hear about it before it was announced that an invitation was being extended to him? No. That's what the problem is right now. That's where we have to. That's what we have to focus on moving forward. We need to make sure that the process of who we invite to speak at Rutgers and thereby represent us, the students, is as inclusive a process as possible to make sure that student voices are included, to make sure that the faculty certainly is not circumvented in the process again, and to make sure that we have cultural representation, we have every possible type of representation that we can to really be able to proudly say that we are a diverse university as we claim we are. That's what we need to focus on.
Hi, my name is Rahman. Hi. So I think that sort of skirts by the question a little bit though, because so if you had everybody voting at Rutgers in 2016, probably everybody would well, most people will be down with Obama coming here. Probably, I think you might say maybe not, but if that's the case, if that ends up being the case, do you think that he should still be allowed to come as a result of that democratic process, despite the drone strikes and the violations of the Geneva Conventions?
I think the whole question is why invite politicians in the first place? Why not invite like founder of Google, someone who's really successful, someone who's not as controversial as everyone claims they are?
Also, I'd like to say something about the Obama issue. I feel like protesting it, like I would totally be down to protest against Obama, but I feel like a lot of students would be excited to have Obama come. I feel like that's just the reality. A lot of people do still like Obama, and I feel like that's an issue of educating the student body. Like we would do the same type of steps we did against Condoleezza Rice, but we would really need to get the information out there about just what Obama has been responsible. His drone programs, continuing torture programs, his domestic spying programs, and all these other issues. We would really need to change the whole narrative. And I believe that most likely, I believe a large portion of the student body would be supportive of Obama, and we couldn't necessarily go against their wishes. When it came to Condoleezza Rice, most students didn't really care. There's not really a whole support base for her here. So with Obama, it would be a much different situation. But I would be 100% supporting protesting against him.
And I would just like to add a real quick that to all the people that are asking these kind of questions, it's what we are advocating for, and one of the reasons why this movement started to begin with was to really the manner in which the university selects commencement speakers is completely undemocratic and surpasses the will of faculty members, surpasses the will of students. And we would really like, and one of the things that we did with this campaign and really got lost in the heat of all the protests and everything that had to do with Condoleezza Rice is that we wanted to create a more inclusive, a more democratic atmosphere in selecting a commencement speaker. So if somebody like President Barack Obama is democratically chosen, then that's one thing. But when it came to Condoleezza Rice, they sidestepped even their already existing undemocratic process in selecting commencement speakers. So that's really where the issue lies. And it's a whole different, if we can get a democratic process to be enacted here, where there can be committees that exist of students and exist of faculty members and even administrators if that need be. And if that decision is democratically made, it's a whole different question about what we do and how we do it. And that's just, I think that's something that people should just, try to sink in.
And to add to that, the democratic process also always leaves room for protest. So sure, you can vote, have a majority vote in support of Obama coming to speak at our university, but that doesn't mean that the minority isn't going to also speak up and protest again and have their voices be heard just like they did here.
So my name is Aaron. I moved in across the river here in 1974. I've seen a few university presidents here. I actually have been working at other institutions as a faculty member. I am very inspired, and the analysis you just had about what could happen and might not happen about something in the future was, I think, extremely interesting, but also the sort of camaraderie and the sort of communality and the willingness to sort of have differences and work them out in some sense. You really worked this up here. That was really amazing. And I do have something. You reminded me about my graduation as an undergraduate, and it was a president that spoke at my a sitting president that spoke at my graduation. And I actually saw him fly in from Detroit in three separate. He's a big man. 3 helicopters brought him in from Detroit. I was on the edge of the university football stadium, one of the Big Ten, how they make their stadiums, at that time in 1964. And the Great Society speech was given on that campus, the University of Michigan. And it was a really wonderful speech. All right, so what I'm doing is sort of giving you a kind of an anecdote, the kind of anecdote that is nowhere near what we got from one of the academics earlier, who was so inspired and interested in a certain area of the world as a child, and now is talking about it and has seen things happen in that part of the world, which if any of the people who were actually involved in making the decisions about that war had actually had the experience of, they might have said, hey, hold on, there are people there. This could be a horrible situation. At any rate, that president, LBJ, was hounded out of office after being elected for the first time and wanting to go for another election. We do not know what's going to happen in the future about this president either. But the thing that might be most important is that you guys keep talking to each other and keep trying to figure out things and inspiring some old fogies.
Sort of a comment. My name is Reza. I was actually at the sit-in, and this really amazing thing happened because I had to leave, a little bit early, and I went out the front door and I got on a bus to go to Livingston because I had a quiz, and there were these kids sitting in the front of the bus, and we were taking the LX and we were passing. We were going on Hamilton Street where you can see a very clear view of Old Queens. And I just kept my mouth shut. And these kids, they were like, "What are those? Who is that?" And one of them was like, I know his name, but I'm not gonna say. He was like, "Oh, it's so stupid, Condoleezza Rice protesters." And he's like, "You know what? I saw their flyers in the sack, and I just ripped them down. And I saw their flyers in the RSC, and I just ripped them down." And I started laughing at that point because I realized, like, man, we're actually making Rutgers students care. Like, even if it's a bad way, I've never seen Rutgers students actually care this much. And this was testified so clearly in the meetings. I mean, people had exams the next day. People had so much work to do that week. And they sacrificed so much time for these long meetings. And they just came over and over again in larger and larger numbers. And it's like really inspirational. I transferred here. And there were a lot of reasons why I transferred here, but I never knew this would happen towards the last year of my education, and it's made me so incredibly proud and thankful that I made the decision to transfer here because I'm just incredibly inspired by everyone here. And there's some people who received the spotlight in this campaign, and there's some people who are right now sitting in the back of this room who I won't name, but they were also the backbone, and they all deserve the honor, the real honor.
That will be the end of the question session. By the way, whenever we end.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
just
I'd
after
like
your
to say something following what Raja just said. Not only is everyone in this school talking about it, but the whole nation right now is questioning the legitimacy of that Iraq war, and that is something very powerful.
Another thing. It was in terms of student power and the student voice. For all those involved, I don't think 2 weeks ago, let alone the day before you were a freshman here, did you imagine you were going to be on international news media and the mainstream news, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and everything. It's an incredible thing what we did here. But just to, I was already just touching on unity, and I wanted to just say one last thing about it, and this is really about, steps in the future and the steps to bring everybody in as John spoke about for the future. Whenever anything happened, whenever we had to make a decision, we did it as a unit. When we were in a sit-in and the sit-in was coming to a close by the will of Chief of Police Kenneth Cobb and some other people, when we were threatened with arrest, to be criminally prosecuted, to possibly be suspended from the university, we said that it's not like some of us. We had a heated debate, and we said, so a lot of us wanted to stay.
Ezra wanted to get arrested.
And a lot of us wanted to stay and get arrested and see what happened, and a lot of us wanted to, leave and, see if we can live to fight another day. But no matter what happened, and the vote was very, very, very tight. We all acted together. And it wasn't groupthink. It wasn't, like silencing of other people's will. It was the fact that everyone wanted to work as a cohesive unit, and that is something that we do not see almost anywhere today. And the fact that it's happened here is just the beginning that can happen for the next several years at this university, as well throughout society and throughout other universities.
I just want to conclude by saying that once again, thank you guys for staying. We hope that we were able to provide some our insight about this whole situation, and I also hope that you were entertained, because I know earlier, we had great academics. However, with great academics comes with you dropping your heads as well, too, which I did see. So I hope that I kept your heads wide open. And once again, class of 2014. Okay, so at 9:30, which is in 3 minutes, tune into the Kelly File on Fox tonight, where you see Carmelo Cintron Vivas, who is our media spokesman. He will be having a debate with a conservative and he's a liberal versus a conservative, so tune into that. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Francois.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for this amazing panel and for everything you taught us in every way, by your actions and by your words tonight. Now, with protest historically come protest songs, and so I do invite you to stick around and listen to the songs of Spook Candy. Thank you again so very much.
We're going to have some great songs. I'll take a moment to introduce our next performer, Spook Candy. First, I want to thank the students. You've done something truly impressive, and I'm very proud of you. So, Spook Candy is a man who should need no introduction to this crowd, but nonetheless, I'm going to give him one anyway. He is a loyal son of Rutgers. He's an alumnus. He's a giver. He has given so many musicians in the state of New Jersey their start at the open mic nights that he's organized. He's a folk singer and songwriter. He's performed many times with many of the great figures and legends of the protest movement. Most particularly, he's played many times with Pete Seeger and knows his whole catalog. And he's going to play a couple of the songs. I think I heard one of them many years ago at the New Jersey Folk Festival, and he's known all about the actions of Condoleezza Rice and her types, and he's written some songs about it, and they are fairly hard-hitting, so listen up, and we will have a great time. And so I want to thank Spook for coming tonight, because he's about to embark on